From the Magian priest who hijacked Persia's throne to the asylum patient who swore she was Anastasia, this is a calm yet fascinating journey that we're about to embark on, lasting over 3 hours. We'll begin with how a masked priest fooled an ancient empire and move deeper into why modern DNA stepped in to silence a royal bout. Mystery. So put your phone or television remote to the side, dim the lights, and please make sure to like the video, subscribe, and let me know where you are listening from in the comments. Now, let's begin. PSEUDO-SMERDIS. The year was 522 BCE, and the Persian Empire stretched across 3 continents like a golden thread pulled taut. At its center sat Cambyses II, son of Cyrus the Great, leading his armies through the scorching sands of Egypt, conquering Memphis, and pushing toward the mysteries of the Upper Nile. But empires, like threads, have a breaking point. While Cambyses chased glory in foreign lands, something sinister was unfolding in the heart of Persia itself. Back in Persepolis, the imperial court buzzed with nervous energy. Months had passed since any reliable word from the king. The satraps exchanged worried glances across marble halls, where the sound of sandaled feet echoed like whispered conspiracies. In this atmosphere of uncertainty, a Magian priest named Gaumata saw opportunity glinting like a jewel in the darkness. Gaumata knew a terrible secret. Prince Bardia, Cambyses' younger brother and the natural heir to the throne, was dead, not fallen in battle or claimed by disease, but murdered on Cambyses' own orders before the Egyptian campaign began. The king, paranoid about challenges to his rule, had eliminated his sibling in secret. Only a handful of people knew the truth, and Gaumata was one of them. The priest studied his reflection in polished bronze, noting the similarities that fate had carved into his features. With careful cultivation, he could pass for the dead prince. The beard could be shaped just so, the voice modulated to match Bardia's remembered tone. In an age before photographs or detailed portraits, identity was a surprisingly malleable thing. When Gaumata emerged from his chambers claiming to be Prince Bardia, the court initially recoiled in shock. But the resemblance was uncanny, and the priest had done his homework. He knew intimate details of royal life, personal habits, childhood memories that only the true prince would possess. More importantly, he understood the deep frustrations that had been building across the empire. His first acts as the restored prince were masterly political theatre. He declared a 3-year moratorium on military service, giving exhausted families relief from the constant demands of imperial expansion. Taxes were slashed, particularly the heavy levies that had funded Cambyses' distant adventures. Temples that had been neglected or stripped of their treasures were restored to their former glory. The people, weary of endless wars and crushing taxation, welcomed their prince with genuine joy. For 7 months, Gaumata ruled as Prince Bardia, and the empire seemed to breathe easier. Trade flourished as resources were redirected from military campaigns to domestic prosperity. The Magian's reforms revealed just how deeply the Persian people had yearned for peace and stability. But such deceptions, however well-intentioned, carry the seeds of their own destruction. Far to the west, a young nobleman named Darius had been watching events unfold with growing suspicion. Son of Hystaspes, a satrap of Parthia, Darius possessed the kind of sharp political mind that made him dangerous to impostors. He began gathering evidence, questioning servants, cross-referencing stories. Slowly, methodically, he built a case that the beloved Prince Bardia was nothing more than an elaborate fraud. Darius didn't work alone. Around him crystallized a conspiracy of 6 other Persian nobles, each with their own reasons for doubting the pretender's identity. They called themselves the 7 Persians, and their plan was as audacious as it was simple: expose the fraud and seize power for themselves. The confrontation came swift and brutal. In September of 522 BCE, the 7 Persians stormed the palace at Sikayovati. Gaumata, for all his political acumen, was no warrior. He fell beneath their swords, his blood seeping into the very stones where he had held court as a false prince. The great deception was over. But Darius, now poised to claim the throne for himself, faced a problem. The empire had genuinely loved their fake Bardia. His reforms had been popular, his reign a welcome respite from the militaristic excesses of Cambyses. How do you explain to a grieving people that their beloved prince was actually a lying priest? The answer lay in masterful propaganda. Darius commissioned the great Behistun inscription, carved into living rock for all eternity. In 3 languages, it told the official story. How the evil Magian had deceived the noble Persians. How the righteous 7 had restored truth to the empire. The inscription painted Gaumata as a dark sorcerer who had bewitched the people, while Darius emerged as the heroic liberator. The legacy of PSEUDO-SMERDIS would echo through centuries. His brief reign demonstrated how the vast scale of ancient empires, combined with primitive communication systems, created perfect conditions for imposture. A skilled pretender could seize power simply by appearing at the right place and time, claiming the right name. The Persian Empire learned a hard lesson about the importance of clear succession and reliable intelligence networks. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of Gaumata's story is how it reveals the gap between what rulers thought their people wanted and what they actually needed. The false prince's popularity wasn't built on lies but on policies that genuinely improved ordinary lives. In trying to be a better Bardia than Bardia himself might have been, the Magian created a template for how imposture could sometimes serve the common good, even as it violated the sacred bonds of legitimacy that held empires together. Andriscus. In the dusty town of Adramyttium, on the western edge of Asia Minor, a young man named Andriscus spent his days bent over vats of steaming cloth, his hands stained with the dyes and chemicals of his trade. He was a fuller, one of those essential but unremarkable craftsmen who cleaned and prepared textiles for the wealthy. His world smelled of lanolin and lye, his days measured by the rhythm of scrubbing and rinsing. But in his mind, grander visions danced. The year was around 153 BCE, and the eastern Mediterranean still reverberated with the aftershocks of Rome's brutal conquest of Macedonia. Just 20 years earlier, the Roman legions had crushed King Perseus at the Battle of Pydna, dragging the last Antigonid monarch back to Rome in chains. Macedonia, once the launching pad for Alexander's world-conquering armies, had been carved up into 4 separate republics, its royal bloodline seemingly extinguished forever. But Andriscus had been listening to the stories that drifted through the markets and taverns. Veterans spoke in hushed tones of the fallen king's dignity, of how Perseus had maintained his regal bearing even in defeat. Merchants from Macedonia brought tales of a people who still mourned their lost independence, who whispered that Roman rule sat on their shoulders like an ill-fitting cloak. In the privacy of his workshop, Andriscus began to practice. He studied his reflection in still water, imagining how a king might hold his head, how royal blood might flow through common veins. The fuller's son discovered he possessed a natural gift for performance, an ability to project authority that seemed to transform his very appearance. More importantly, he understood that identity in the ancient world was fluid, malleable, dependent on recognition rather than documentation. When Andriscus first announced his true identity as the son of Perseus, the reaction was mixed. Some laughed outright at the pretensions of a common tradesman, but others, particularly among the dispossessed and displaced, found something compelling in his claim. He possessed an uncanny knowledge of royal protocol, court procedures, and intimate details of Perseus's life that seemed impossible for a mere fuller to know. The pretender's story was masterfully crafted. He claimed to be an illegitimate son, hidden away for his own protection during the chaos of the Roman conquest. This explained both his humble circumstances and his remarkable familiarity with royal traditions. He spoke of secret messages from his dying father, of loyal retainers who had spirited him away to safety, of a destiny that could no longer be denied. Word of the returned prince spread like wildfire through the Greek world. In city after city, crowds gathered to hear him speak. Andriscus possessed genuine charisma, a magnetic presence that seemed to validate his extraordinary claims. He painted vivid pictures of a restored Macedonia, free from Roman taxation and military service, governed once again by its rightful bloodline. The response in Macedonia itself was electric. Farmers abandoned their fields, craftsmen closed their shops, and former soldiers emerged from retirement to flock to the pretender's banner. The Roman-imposed republics crumbled as local officials either fled or declared their allegiance to the new Philip VI, as Andriscus now styled himself. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed as though the impossible had occurred. The dead kingdom lived again, breathing through the voice of a fuller's son who had convinced thousands that royal blood flowed in his veins. Andriscus established his court in Pella, the ancient capital of the Macedonian kings, and began issuing decrees as though 2 decades of Roman rule had been merely a nightmare from which his people had finally awakened. But Rome, predictably, was not amused. The Senate dispatched Quintus Caecilius Metellus with a substantial force to deal with what they initially dismissed as a minor rebellion. The Romans had not anticipated the depth of popular support for the pretender, nor the genuine military threat that Andriscus would pose. The campaigns that followed revealed the fuller's son to be not just a skilled impostor, but a capable military leader. He won several early engagements against Roman forces, demonstrating tactical acumen that seemed to support his claims to royal heritage. His victories drew even more supporters to his cause, creating a snowball effect that genuinely threatened Roman control of the region. However, the fundamental mathematics of the situation remained unchanged. Macedonia, even united and inspired, could not match the resources and professional military machine of Rome. Metellus gradually gained the upper hand, systematically dismantling the pretender's support network and cornering his forces. The final confrontation came at the Battle of Pydna in 148 BCE, fought ironically on the same ground where Perseus had met his doom. History repeated itself with cruel precision. Andriscus, like his supposed father, was captured and marched off to Rome in chains. The dream of Macedonian independence died a second death, this time permanently. In Rome, the false Philip VI was paraded through the streets during Metellus's triumph, a living symbol of the futility of resisting Roman power. The crowds who had once cheered Perseus's humiliation now witnessed the spectacle of his son's defeat. Shortly after, Andriscus was executed, his remarkable journey from fuller to king ending in the traditional manner of defeated enemies. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Rome abandoned the pretense of Macedonian self-governance, incorporating the region directly as a Roman province. The 4 republics were dissolved, their boundaries redrawn to better serve imperial administration. Macedonia's final absorption into the Roman system was complete, and with it died the last vestiges of the kingdom that had once dominated the known world. Yet the myth of Andriscus lived on in the whispered stories of the dispossessed and the conquered. His brief reign became a symbol of what might have been, a reminder that even the mightiest empires could be challenged by those who dared to claim the mantles of lost sovereignty. Pseudo-NERO I. The summer of 68 CE had been a season of blood and chaos across the Roman Empire. In his golden palace on the Palatine Hill, Emperor Nero faced the collapse of everything he had built. The armies of Gaul had risen in revolt, the Senate had declared him a public enemy, and even his own Praetorian Guard had abandoned him. As the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed through the marble corridors, the last emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty made his final, desperate choice. With a trembling hand, Nero pressed a dagger to his throat, muttering his final words, "What an artist perishes in me." The blade found its mark, and with it died not just a man, but an era, or so Rome believed. But death, particularly the death of such a larger-than-life figure, rarely provides the clean endings that history demands. Far from the capital, in the sun-drenched hills of Cyprus, a traveling actor named Terentius Maximus made his living entertaining crowds with songs and theatrical performances. He possessed a remarkable gift. This voice, his mannerisms, even his physical appearance bore an uncanny resemblance to the recently deceased emperor. In taverns and marketplaces, audiences would gasp at the similarity, joking that Nero himself seemed to have returned from the dead. But Terentius was no mere entertainer satisfied with amusing country folk. He had been watching the political situation unfold with the calculating eye of a born opportunist. The year of the 4 emperors had plunged the empire into civil war, with Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian each claiming the purple in rapid succession. In this atmosphere of uncertainty, rumors had begun to circulate, whispers that Nero might not be truly dead, that he had escaped to the east and would return to reclaim his throne. The actor decided to transform rumor into reality. He began carefully cultivating his resemblance to the dead emperor, studying Nero's mannerisms from those who had known him, perfecting the imperial voice that had once commanded the known world. More importantly, he crafted a story that would explain his survival and justify his return. According to Terentius's carefully constructed narrative, Nero had indeed escaped the conspirators in Rome, fleeing eastward to gather loyal forces for his inevitable return. He had spent months in hiding, preparing for the moment when he would reclaim what was rightfully his. The story was plausible enough to those who wanted to believe it, and desperate enough to appeal to those who had suffered under the chaos of civil war. The eastern provinces of the empire had always held a special affection for Nero. His love of Greek culture, his patronage of the arts, and his grand building projects had made him genuinely popular in cities like Athens, Alexandria, and Antioch. Unlike in Rome, where his excesses had bred contempt among the senatorial class, in the East he was remembered as a cultured ruler who had brought prosperity and stability. When news spread that Nero had returned and was gathering forces in Cyprus, the reaction was electric. Delegations arrived from across the eastern Mediterranean, bringing pledges of support and offers of military aid. Cities that had groaned under the heavy taxation imposed by the successive emperors of the Civil War period began to dream of liberation under their beloved Nero's restored rule. Terentius played his role to perfection. He held court with the dignity of a true emperor, issuing proclamations and receiving embassies with the practiced ease of one born to command. His performances for that is what they were convinced even skeptical observers that they were witnessing the genuine article. The actor had become the emperor, at least in the eyes of those who desperately wanted to believe. But the pretender's success also attracted the attention of more dangerous audiences. Roman intelligence networks, still functioning despite the chaos at home, began to investigate these disturbing reports from the East. Governor after governor received urgent dispatches demanding clarification about the situation in Cyprus and the surrounding regions. The response from Rome was swift and decisive. While the capital burned with civil war, the Roman state could not afford to have a pretender claiming imperial authority in the wealthy eastern provinces. A naval expedition was quietly organized, tasked with capturing or killing the false Nero before his movement could gain further momentum. The end came suddenly and without the dramatic flourishes that had characterized the pretender's rise. Roman ships appeared off the coast of Cyprus, their bronze rams cutting through the azure waters like instruments of fate. Terentius, for all his theatrical skills, proved to be no military commander. His followers melted away at the first sign of real danger, leaving the actor alone with his imperial pretensions. The capture was almost anticlimactic. Roman soldiers found Terentius in a seaside villa, still wearing the purple robes that had convinced so many of his authenticity. He was bound in chains and loaded onto a ship bound for Rome, where a very different kind of performance awaited him. The execution was public and brutal. designed to demonstrate that the real Nero was truly dead, and that no pretender could hope to claim his legacy. Terentius died as he had lived his final months as a performer, though this time his audience was a bloodthirsty mob rather than adoring provincials. Yet even in death, the first false Nero had accomplished something significant. He had demonstrated that the emperor's demise, rather than ending his story, had merely transformed it into something more powerful and enduring. The Nero Redivivus legend, the belief that the emperor would return from the dead, took root in the popular imagination, particularly in the eastern provinces where his memory remained golden. This myth would prove remarkably persistent, outlasting the Flavian dynasty that had worked so hard to erase Nero's memory. It would inspire future pretenders, fuel resistance movements, and even influence early Christian thought about the Antichrist. The traveling actor from Cyprus had created something far more lasting than any theatrical performance he had given birth to a legend that would haunt the Roman Empire for generations to come. Pseudo-Nero II. The execution of Terentius Maximus in Rome should have ended the matter. The first false Nero had paid the ultimate price for his audacious imposture, his body displayed publicly to prove that the real emperor remained firmly in his grave. But legends, once born, prove remarkably difficult to kill. They take on lives of their own, feeding on hope and desperation, growing stronger with each telling. In the borderlands where the Roman Empire met its eternal rival, Parthia, whispers continued to circulate in markets and caravanserais. Merchants spoke in hushed tones of a figure gathering followers in the eastern shadows, preparing for a return that would shake the foundations of the known world. These were not idle tavern tales, but carefully cultivated rumors, part of a larger political game being played across the steppes and desert kingdoms. Around 79 CE, approximately a decade after the first pretender's death, a second claimant emerged from the political chaos of the eastern frontier. This new false Nero was a more sophisticated creation, his appearance and bearing suggesting either genuine imperial training or remarkably skilled preparation. Unlike the Cypriot actor who had relied primarily on physical resemblance, this pretender possessed intimate knowledge of Roman court protocols and imperial procedures that impressed even skeptical observers. The timing of his emergence was far from coincidental. The Flavian dynasty, despite its military successes, still struggled with questions of legitimacy. Vespasian and his son Titus were competent administrators and skilled generals, but they lacked the sacred bloodline that had legitimized their Julio-Claudian predecessors. This created a psychological opening that skilled pretenders could exploit, particularly in regions where Nero's memory remained untarnished by the scandals that had turned Rome against him. More importantly, this second false Nero had what his predecessor had lacked: serious backing from the Parthian court. The relationship between Rome and Parthia had always been complex, a delicate balance of war and diplomacy played out across the Armenian highlands and Mesopotamian plains. Parthian kings had long understood that internal Roman instability served their strategic interests, and a credible pretender to the imperial throne represented a potentially valuable asset. The Parthian king Artabanus III welcomed the second false Nero with full diplomatic honors, recognizing him as the legitimate Roman emperor and offering military support for his restoration. This royal endorsement transformed what might have been dismissed as another theatrical performance into a genuine diplomatic crisis. Roman ambassadors found themselves facing a pretender who spoke with the authority of a great power behind him, whose claims could not be simply ignored or brushed aside. The pretender established his court in Ctesiphon, the Parthian capital, where he began issuing proclamations and receiving embassies from across the Eastern world. His presence there sent shockwaves through Roman diplomatic circles, as client kings and allied cities were forced to choose between acknowledging the Flavian dynasty or recognizing the claims of the restored Nero. But the harsh realities of international politics soon intruded upon the pretender's imperial dreams. Parthian support, while impressive in theory, proved limited in practice. The Parthian king was willing to use the false Nero as a diplomatic bargaining chip, but he was not prepared to risk a full-scale war with Rome over the restoration of a foreign dynasty. When Roman pressure mounted and the strategic situation shifted, Parthian enthusiasm for the pretender began to cool noticeably. The second false Nero's reign in exile lasted approximately 2 years before collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. Without genuine military support from his Parthian patrons and facing increasing Roman diplomatic pressure, the pretender found his position becoming untenable. His end came not through dramatic military defeat, but through the quiet withdrawal of support, as his usefulness as a diplomatic tool expired. Even as the second pretender faded into historical obscurity, the legend he represented continued to evolve. Around 88 CE, a third false Nero emerged, this time from the northern reaches of the Parthian sphere of influence. This final pretender of the Flavian era was perhaps the most skilled of all, possessing not only the physical attributes necessary for the role, but also the political acumen to build a more sustainable movement. The third false Nero learned from the mistakes of his predecessors. Rather than relying solely on Parthian support, he cultivated relationships with various nomadic tribes and client kingdoms along the Roman frontier. His message was carefully crafted to appeal to diverse audiences. To Romans, he promised a return to the cultural golden age of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. To Parthians, he offered the prospect of a more amenable neighbor. To smaller kingdoms, he suggested greater autonomy under his restored rule. This final pretender's movement gained considerable momentum before ultimately meeting the same fate as its predecessors. The fundamental problem remained unchanged. While the Nero Redivivus legend possessed powerful emotional appeal, it lacked the military and economic resources necessary to challenge the established order. The Flavian dynasty, despite its legitimacy issues, controlled the world's most professional military machine and the empire's vast fiscal resources. The collapse of the third false Nero, around 89 CE, marked the end of an era. The Flavian dynasty had finally established its legitimacy firmly enough that pretenders could no longer exploit questions about imperial succession. More importantly, the generation that had lived through Nero's actual reign was aging, making it increasingly difficult for new pretenders to find audiences who remembered the real emperor well enough to be convinced by imitations. Yet the broader implications of these Eastern pretenders extended far beyond their individual failures. They had demonstrated how the Roman Empire's vast size and complex diplomatic relationships created opportunities for skilled impostors to exploit. They had shown how foreign powers could weaponize nostalgia and dynastic claims to pressure their rivals. Most importantly, they had proven that the death of a charismatic ruler often marked not the end of their political relevance, but the beginning of their transformation into something far more dangerous, a symbol that could inspire resistance, rebellion, and hope for restoration. The legacy of these Eastern false Neros would echo through subsequent centuries, influencing how later pretenders approached their craft and how governments developed countermeasures against dynastic imposture. Their story revealed the essential truth that in the ancient world, identity was performance, legitimacy was recognition, and power belonged to those who could most convincingly claim it. False Baldwin. The year 1225 dawned grey and bitter across the muddy fields of Flanders, where peasants bent their backs to the thankless task of making charcoal. In the forest clearings outside Mortagne, smoke rose in lazy spirals from earthen mounds, where wood slowly transformed into the black gold that heated manor houses and smithies throughout the Low Countries. It was humble work for humble men, their faces permanently stained with soot, their hands cracked from handling burning timber. Among them worked a man whose destiny would soon shake the very foundations of medieval Europe. His name, if the records can be trusted, was Bertrand de Rey, though he would claim a far grander identity before his tale reached its bloody conclusion. To his fellow charcoal burners, he seemed an ordinary enough fellow, strong of back, quick of wit, possessed of that peculiar charisma that made men listen when he spoke around the evening fires. But Bertrand had been nursing a secret that burned hotter than any charcoal kiln, a deception so audacious that it would convince nobles and commoners alike that miracles still walked the earth. 20 years had passed since the Fourth Crusade had taken a disastrous turn, transforming what should have been a holy war into a sordid commercial venture. Instead of liberating Jerusalem, the crusading armies had sacked Constantinople, carving up the Byzantine Empire like a feast day goose. From this chaos had emerged the Latin Empire of Constantinople, ruled briefly by Baldwin IX, Count of Flanders, until disaster struck at the Battle of Adrianople in 1205. The battle had been a catastrophe beyond imagining. Bulgarian and Vlach forces, fighting with the desperate fury of men defending their homeland, had crushed the Latin army. Emperor Baldwin himself had vanished in the melee, his fate unknown. Some said he had died fighting heroically at the front lines. Others whispered that he had been captured and dragged away to rot in a Bulgarian dungeon. No body was ever found. No reliable witness ever came forward, and this uncertainty had festered like an open wound in the collective memory of Flanders. For 2 decades, Baldwin's daughters, Margaret and Joan, had ruled the county in his absence, their authority constantly challenged by those who claimed their father might yet return. The people of Flanders, ground down by taxes and military service, had grown fond of telling stories about their vanished count. In taverns and markets, they spoke of how Baldwin would one day return from his eastern captivity, older and wiser, ready to restore the golden age they imagined had existed before his departure. Bertrand had listened to these stories with the calculating attention of a born confidence artist. He studied the details of Baldwin's life, memorizing genealogies and court gossip, learning the intimate details that only the true count would know. More importantly, he understood the psychology of grief and hope that made the people of Flanders so vulnerable to a skilled pretender. When the charcoal burner finally emerged from the forests claiming to be the long-lost Emperor Baldwin, his transformation was remarkable. Gone was the soot-stained peasant. In his place stood a figure of regal bearing, whose every gesture spoke of royal blood. His story was perfectly crafted for its audience. He claimed to have spent 20 years in captivity, first in Bulgarian dungeons and later as a slave in the Holy Land, enduring unspeakable hardships while dreaming of his eventual return to Flanders. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Peasants fell to their knees as he passed. Noble ladies wept tears of joy at his miraculous survival, and hardened knights spoke in hushed tones of divine providence. The pretender possessed an uncanny knowledge of court life and personal details that seemed to prove his identity beyond doubt. He knew the names of Baldwin's horses, the layout of his castles, the private jokes shared among his inner circle. More importantly, the false Baldwin understood exactly what his subjects wanted to hear. He promised an end to the crushing taxes that had been imposed to fund his daughter's wars. He spoke of returning to the simple virtues of earlier times, when counts ruled with justice rather than greed. His message resonated powerfully with common folk who had grown tired of being squeezed for every coin by their absent rulers. The pretender's growing influence finally forced a confrontation with legitimate authority. Margaret and Joan, faced with this challenge to their rule, summoned their supposed father to court for formal recognition. The meeting that followed would become one of the most dramatic scenes in medieval political theatre. The two sisters examined the man claiming to be their father with the intensity of women whose lives hung in the balance. They questioned him about intimate family details, childhood memories, shared experiences that only Baldwin would know. For hours the interrogation continued, the pretender answering each query with apparent ease and genuine emotion. But something was wrong. Perhaps it was a gesture that didn't match memory, a story that rang false, or simply the intuition that comes from true familial bonds. Whatever the cause, Margaret and Joan began to see through the deception. Their initial shock gave way to growing certainty that this man, however convincing, was not their father. The exposure came swiftly, once doubt had taken root. Under intense questioning, the pretender's story began to unravel. Details that had seemed convincing in isolation proved contradictory when examined together. The careful facade that Bertrand had constructed crumbled under the relentless pressure of those who knew the truth. The trial that followed was a masterpiece of medieval legal drama. The false Baldwin was forced to confess his deception before a court that included many who had genuinely believed in his identity. His real name was revealed, his humble origins exposed, his elaborate lies dismantled piece by piece. The charcoal burner, who had briefly convinced a county that he was their emperor, stood revealed as nothing more than a skilled actor who had overplayed his hand. The execution was swift and public, designed to demonstrate that even the most convincing impostor could not escape justice. Bertrand de Rey died as dramatically as he had lived his final months with crowds, watching his every move, though this time they came to witness justice rather than to celebrate a miracle. Yet even in death, the false Baldwin had accomplished something remarkable. His brief reign had revealed the depths of popular dissatisfaction with legitimate authority and the power of hope to overcome reason. The very fact that so many had wanted to believe in his return spoke to the failures of those who ruled in his name. The case also demonstrated how medieval society's limited communication networks and lack of reliable documentation created perfect conditions for imposture. In an age before photographs or fingerprints, identity was largely a matter of recognition and consensus. A skilled pretender with sufficient knowledge and charisma could convince entire populations that impossible survivals had actually occurred. Most importantly, the story of false Baldwin illustrated the medieval mind's deep belief in the possibility of miraculous returns. This was an era when people expected divine intervention in human affairs, when the resurrection of the dead was not just possible but promised. The false Baldwin had exploited this religious sensibility, transforming political ambition into something that resembled divine providence. John DEYDRAS. The bells of Oxford were ringing. Compline when the stranger first appeared at the gates of the ancient city, his arrival marked, not by fanfare, but by the curious mixture of authority and desperation that would characterize his entire brief, bizarre career. The year was 1318, and England groaned under the weight of King Edward II's disastrous military defeats in Scotland, economic chaos at home, and the growing shadow of his queen's displeasure. Into this atmosphere of discontent stepped a man whose audacious claim would make him the laughingstock of chroniclers and the tragic hero of common folk who dreamed of better kings. His name was John DEYDRAS, though he would soon insist on being called by quite different titles. To those who met him in the muddy streets around Oxford's emerging colleges, he appeared to be a groom or stable hand, the kind of weathered, practical man who knew horses better than books, whose hands bore the permanent stains of leather oil and hay dust. His most distinctive feature was immediately apparent. His left ear had been partially bitten off in some long-ago altercation, leaving a jagged scar that would become central to his extraordinary story. But John harbored secrets that transformed his humble appearance into something far more significant. As he began to speak to anyone who would listen, his tale unfolded with the kind of compelling detail that made skeptics pause and believers weep. He was not, he claimed, a mere stable hand at all. He was Edward of Caernarfon, the rightful king of England, switched at birth with a peasant's child through the machinations of Queen Isabella and her conspirators. The story he told was intricate enough to be believable and dramatic enough to capture imaginations. According to John's carefully constructed narrative, the real prince had been born with a distinctive mark, the very scar that now marked his own ear. Fearing that this deformity would make their son unfit for kingship, the royal family had secretly exchanged him with a perfect peasant child of the same age. The true prince had been raised in obscurity, while an impostor sat on England's throne. John's timing was exquisite. Edward II's reign had become a catalogue of disasters that made his subjects question whether divine providence truly blessed their monarch. The catastrophic defeat at Bannockburn in 1314 had established Scottish independence and humiliated English military pride. The king's relationship with his favourites, particularly Piers Gaveston and later Hugh Despenser, had scandalised the nobility and created persistent rumours about his fitness to rule. Most damning of all, his marriage to Isabella of France had deteriorated into barely concealed mutual hatred. Into this atmosphere of royal failure, John DEYDRAS inserted himself as the solution to England's problems. His performances for that is what they were took place in the most public venues he could find. Market squares, church steps, tavern yards, anywhere crowds gathered to hear news or entertainment. He spoke with the natural charisma of a born orator, his voice carrying the authority of absolute conviction. The content of his speeches was perfectly calibrated to appeal to popular frustrations. He denounced the crushing taxes that had been imposed to fund Edward's failed military campaigns. He condemned the favoritism that elevated unsuitable men to positions of power, while worthy nobles were ignored. Most powerfully, he promised that his restoration would herald a return to the golden age of strong kingship that England's people remembered from earlier reigns. John's knowledge of court life was surprisingly detailed for a man of his supposed humble origins. He could describe the layout of royal palaces, the protocols of court ceremony, and the personal habits of nobility with an accuracy that impressed even skeptical listeners. This insider information lent credibility to his claims and suggested that his story might contain more truth than reason would suggest. The response to his proclamations was immediate and polarizing. Common folk, already disposed to believe that their troubles stemmed from illegitimate rule, found his message deeply appealing. Here was an explanation for why their king seemed so unsuited to his role, why military disasters befell English armies, why the realm seemed cursed with misfortune. If Edward was indeed an impostor, then England's problems had a solution: restore the rightful king. But the pretender's growing influence also attracted dangerous attention. Royal officials, initially inclined to dismiss him as a harmless madman, began to recognize the threat he represented. His speeches were drawing increasingly large crowds, and disturbing reports suggested that some listeners were taking his claims seriously enough to speak of armed support. The authorities moved with characteristic medieval efficiency. John DEYDRAS was arrested on charges of treason and sedition. His brief career as a royal claimant brought to an abrupt end. The trial that followed was less a legal proceeding than a public humiliation designed to demonstrate the folly of challenging legitimate authority. Under interrogation, the pretender's story began to unravel with tragic inevitability. His detailed knowledge of court life was revealed to come from service in royal stables, where grooms often overheard conversations and witnessed ceremonies. His supposed royal birthmark was nothing more than an old injury from a tavern brawl. Most damaging of all, his own neighbours from Oxford came forward to testify about his true identity and humble origins. The confession that emerged was both pathetic and revealing. John DEYDRAS admitted that he was indeed a stable hand, driven to his desperate imposture by a combination of genuine grievance against royal taxation and the intoxicating experience of commanding attention and respect. He had begun with small lies that had grown larger, as audiences responded positively, until he found himself trapped in a deception that had spiraled beyond his control. The execution was swift and public, designed to serve as a warning to other potential pretenders. John died as he had lived his final months performing for a crowd, though this time his audience came to witness justice rather than to hear promises of restoration. The brief reign of the stable-hand king was over, leaving behind only the echo of speeches that had briefly convinced desperate people that their troubles had solutions. Contemporary chroniclers treated John DEYDRAS with a mixture of amusement and contempt. dismissing him as a fool who had overreached his station. But their accounts, despite their bias, reveal something more significant. The story of a man whose humble origins had not prevented him from dreaming of kingship, and whose dreams had temporarily convinced others that miraculous transformations were possible. The case illuminated the vulnerability of medieval royal authority to challenges from unexpected sources. In an age when kings claimed to rule by divine right, the appearance of a credible pretender raised disturbing questions about the nature of legitimacy itself. If a stable hand could convince crowds that he was their rightful monarch, what did that say about the foundation of political authority? More broadly, John DEYDRAS represented the eternal appeal of the idea that current suffering might be relieved by the restoration of rightful rule. His brief moment of influence demonstrated how effectively a skilled performer could exploit popular discontent, transforming personal grievances into political movements that challenged the established order. TOMASO da TRIVULZIO. The salons of Renaissance Venice hummed with excitement in the spring of 1465, their marble floors echoing with the footsteps of nobles and merchants eager to meet the remarkable visitor who had arrived from the eastern Mediterranean. In a city built on trade and intrigue, where fortunes rose and fell with the tide, the appearance of exotic royalty was always cause for celebration. And this particular visitor claimed credentials that made even jaded Venetian aristocrats pause in wonder. He was, he insisted, Prince Tommaso da Trivulzio, rightful heir to the throne of Cyprus and descendant of King Janus himself. Venice, in the mid-15th century, was perfectly positioned to appreciate such a claim. The Maritime Republic's extensive trading network stretched across the Mediterranean, bringing its merchants into contact with every court, every dynasty, every royal house from Spain to Constantinople. Venetian nobles prided themselves on their cosmopolitan sophistication, their ability to recognize authentic nobility regardless of its origins. They were also, somewhat paradoxically, particularly susceptible to romantic tales of exiled princes and lost kingdoms. Tommaso understood his audience with the instincts of a master performer. He had studied not just the genealogy of Cyprus's ruling dynasty, but the psychology of those he hoped to deceive. He knew that Venetian society valued cultural refinement as much as political power, that a man's worth was measured by his ability to quote classical authors as much as by the size of his treasury. Most importantly, he understood that in a city where appearance was everything, the right clothes, the right manner, and the right story could open doors that birth and breeding might keep forever closed. The pretender's physical presence was undeniably impressive, tall and well-proportioned, with the kind of dignified bearing that suggested royal breeding. He moved through Venetian society with the easy confidence of one born to command. His clothes, while not ostentatiously wealthy, displayed the subtle elegance that marked true aristocracy. More importantly, his conversation revealed an intimate knowledge of Mediterranean politics, court protocols, and dynastic histories that seemed to validate his extraordinary claims. His story, like all successful deceptions, contained enough truth to be believable and enough drama to be compelling. Cyprus, he explained, had fallen under Genoese and later Venetian influence, its native dynasty reduced to powerless figureheads before finally being extinguished altogether. He himself had spent years in exile, moving from court to court across the eastern Mediterranean, seeking support for his restoration, while avoiding the assassins sent by those who had usurped his rightful inheritance. The tale resonated powerfully with Venetian sensibilities. Here was a prince without a kingdom, a man of unquestionable nobility reduced to seeking charity from foreign merchants. The romantic appeal was irresistible, particularly among the wives and daughters of Venetian patricians who devoured tales of chivalric adventure with the same appetite they brought to religious devotions. More practically, Tommaso offered his new patrons something that money could not buy: connection to legitimate royalty. In a republic where noble status was jealously guarded and constantly contested, association with a genuine prince, even an exiled one, conferred prestige that could not be purchased. Venetian families began competing to host the distinguished visitor, each hoping to bask in the reflected glory of royal association. The pretender proved to be an expensive guest. His maintenance required fine clothes, expensive lodgings, and the kind of generous entertainment that befitted his supposed station. But Venetian society, accustomed to treating hospitality as investment, proved remarkably willing to subsidize his lifestyle. Wealthy merchants advanced him substantial sums, confident that a restored king of Cyprus would remember their generosity with appropriate commercial privileges. For several months, Tomaso lived like the prince he claimed to be. He attended banquets where senators sought his opinion on Mediterranean politics, participated in religious ceremonies where his supposed royal blood added luster to civic occasions, and generally enjoyed the kind of life that his actual humble origins had never provided. The deception seemed perfect, sustainable, and profitable for all involved. But perfection, particularly in matters of imposture, rarely survives close examination. As Tomaso's stay in Venice extended from weeks to months, certain inconsistencies began to trouble his hosts. His knowledge of Cyprus, while impressive, occasionally contained errors that a native prince should not have made. His understanding of court ceremonies, though generally accurate, sometimes reflected practices from other kingdoms rather than Cypriot traditions. More damaging still were the questions that began arriving from other Mediterranean courts. Venetian diplomats, proud of their royal guest, had written to colleagues across the region, boasting of their association with the Cypriot prince. The responses they received were puzzling at first, then troubling, and finally devastating. No one else had heard of Prince Tomaso da Trivulzio. Court records made no mention of his birth, his exile, or his travels. The genealogies that should have contained his name were conspicuously silent. The investigation that followed was conducted with the methodical thoroughness that made Venetian administration so effective. Scholars were commissioned to examine historical records, genealogists were hired to trace Cypriot royal bloodlines, and merchants were questioned about their knowledge of Eastern Mediterranean nobility. The results were unambiguous. Prince Tomaso da Trivulzio had never existed, except in his own imagination. The confrontation, when it came, was conducted with the diplomatic courtesy that Venetian society prized above almost all other virtues. Rather than subjecting their guest to public humiliation, the authorities arranged a private meeting where evidence of his deception was presented with the kind of respectful formality that acknowledged his undeniable charm and intelligence, even as it demolished his claims. Tomaso's response revealed the quick wit that had made his imposture so successful. Rather than attempting to maintain his story in the face of overwhelming contrary evidence, he acknowledged his deception with the grace of a gentleman accepting defeat in a well-played game. His confession was complete, honest, and delivered with the kind of rueful humor that made even his victims admire his audacity. The punishment that followed was remarkably lenient by the standards of the era. Instead of execution or exile, Tomaso found himself imprisoned for debt, a consequence of his inability to repay the substantial sums he had borrowed on the strength of his false identity. Venetian law, with its commercial focus, treated his crime as a form of fraud rather than treason, reducing his offense from the political to the financial. Even in prison, the former pretender retained the charm that had made his brief reign so successful. His fellow inmates found him an entertaining companion, and his jailers discovered that he possessed a remarkable talent for organizing the chaotic social dynamics of incarceration. Stories of his wit and wisdom began to circulate beyond the prison walls, creating a legend that would outlive his actual presence in Venice. The theatrical companies of Venice, always eager for new material, soon began incorporating elements of Tomaso's story into their performances. His tale became a standard plot device in comedies about social climbing and romantic deception, ensuring that his name would be remembered long after his actual crimes had been forgotten. The broader implications of Tomaso's case extended far beyond the personal tragedy of a failed impostor. His story illuminated the complex relationship between Renaissance humanism's celebration of individual achievement and the traditional hierarchies that still governed European society. In an age when scholars argued that virtue and learning could elevate men above their birth, the line between legitimate self-improvement and fraudulent transformation became increasingly blurred. Lambert Simnel. The morning mist hung thick over the fields of Oxfordshire in the spring of 1486, carrying with it the scent of new grass and the distant echo of church bells calling the faithful to prayer. In a modest bakery on the outskirts of Oxford, a boy of perhaps 10 years worked beside his father, his small hands learning the ancient rhythm of kneading dough that had sustained his family for generations. His name was Lambert Simnel, and by all rights, his story should have ended there, another baker's son following in his father's footsteps, his life measured in loaves and market days. But fate, in the form of an ambitious priest, had other plans for young Lambert. Richard Simmons was not a man content with the quiet obscurity of parish life. As a minor cleric in Oxford, he possessed the kind of restless intelligence that chafed against the limitations of his station. He watched the great game of English politics from the sidelines, observing how fortunes rose and fell with each shift in dynastic loyalty. More importantly, he understood that in the aftermath of the Wars of the Roses, England's political landscape remained dangerously unstable, full of opportunities for those bold enough to seize them. The Battle of Bosworth Field had settled one question. Henry Tudor now sat on England's throne as Henry VII. But victory in battle did not automatically confer legitimacy in the minds of all subjects. The new king's claim to the crown was thin, based more on conquest than blood, and significant portions of the nobility remained quietly loyal to the House of York. In this atmosphere of uncertainty, Simons saw an opportunity that would require only the right instrument to exploit. Young Lambert possessed certain qualities that made him perfect for the priest's purposes. He was intelligent enough to learn his lines but young enough to be molded, attractive enough to look royal but common enough to be available. Most importantly, he bore a passing resemblance to the children who might, under different circumstances, have legitimate claims to England's throne. With careful training and the right presentation, the baker's son could become something far more valuably a weapon in the ongoing struggle for dynastic legitimacy. The choice of which royal persona Lambert should adopt required careful consideration. The most obvious candidates were the princes in the Tower, the sons of Edward IV, whose disappearance remained one of England's most haunting mysteries. But their fate, while unknown, was generally assumed to be death, making resurrection claims difficult to sustain. Instead, Simmons chose a more promising target, Edward, Earl of Warwick, son of George, Duke of Clarence, and nephew to both Edward IV and Richard III. The real Earl of Warwick was very much alive, confined in the Tower of London since Henry VII's accession. But this inconvenient fact could be turned to advantage. Simmons would claim that the boy in the Tower was an impostor, that the real Earl had been spirited away to safety and was now ready to claim his rightful inheritance. The story had enough plausibility to appeal to those who wanted to believe it, while the genuine Earl's captivity prevented him from contradicting the narrative. The transformation of Lambert Simnel, from baker's son to royal claimant, was a masterpiece of theatrical preparation. Simons schooled the boy in court etiquette, noble deportment, and the intimate details of Plantagenet family history. Lambert learned to speak with the refined accent of aristocracy, to carry himself with royal dignity, and to recite the genealogies that would support his claim. Most importantly, he learned to project the kind of natural authority that made observers believe they were in the presence of genuine nobility. The priest's first test of his protégé came in Ireland, where Yorkist sympathies remained strong and English royal authority was more theoretical than practical. The Irish nobility, many of whom had supported Richard III and viewed Henry Tudor as a usurper, proved remarkably receptive to the idea that the Earl of Warwick had returned to claim his inheritance. When Lambert stepped off the ship in Dublin, he was greeted not as a pretender, but as a liberator. The Irish response exceeded even Simon's most optimistic expectations. Noble families competed to offer their support to the restored Earl, bringing with them the military resources that could transform a dynastic claim into a genuine political movement. Most significantly, Gerald Fitzgerald, Earl of Kildare and Lord Deputy of Ireland, threw his considerable influence behind the pretender, lending governmental authority to what might otherwise have been dismissed as a baronial conspiracy. The coronation ceremony that followed was unprecedented in its audacity. On May 24, 1487, in Christ Church Cathedral, Dublin, Lambert Simnel was crowned as Edward VI, King of England and Ireland. The crown itself had to be borrowed from a statue of the Virgin Mary, but the symbolism was unmistakable. Here was a direct challenge to Henry Tudor's authority, backed by substantial Irish military power and supported by exiled English Yorkists who had found refuge across the Irish Sea. The new king quickly attracted international attention. Margaret of Burgundy, sister to Edward IV, and implacable enemy of Henry Tudor, provided both financial support and experienced military advisors. Flemish mercenaries, seasoned veterans of European conflicts, began arriving in Ireland to bolster the pretender's forces. What had begun as a priest's ambitious scheme was evolving into a genuine military threat to the Tudor dynasty. Henry VII's response demonstrated the political acumen that had brought him to the throne. Rather than simply dismissing the Irish challenge, he took extraordinary measures to demonstrate that the real Earl of Warwick remained safely in the Tower. The genuine Earl was paraded through London's streets, his identity confirmed by nobles who had known him since childhood. This masterstroke of propaganda should have ended the matter, but Lambert's supporters had invested too much in their cause to abandon it based on inconvenient facts. The invasion of England that followed was both the climax and the doom of Lambert's brief reign. In June 1487, the pretender's forces landed in Lancashire, hoping to rally English Yorkist support to their banner. The army that marched inland included Irish kerns, Flemish professionals, and English exiles, a polyglot force united only by their opposition to Henry Tudor's rule. The Battle of Stokefield on June 16, 1487, was the last major engagement of the Wars of the Roses, though few recognized it as such at the time. Lambert Simnel, barely 11 years old, watched from the rear as experienced soldiers fought and died for his claimed birthright. The battle was hard fought and the outcome uncertain for hours, but ultimately the royal army's superior numbers and organization prevailed. The aftermath of Stokefield revealed Henry VII's political genius. While the adult leaders of the rebellion were executed for treason, Lambert Simnel was spared on account of his youth and obvious manipulation by others. Instead of martyrdom, the former king was given employment in the royal kitchens, initially as a spit-turner and later as a falconer. This calculated mercy served multiple purposes. It demonstrated royal clemency while simultaneously humiliating the pretender and his former supporters. The symbolism of Lambert's fate was perfect. The boy who had briefly worn a crown now turned meat over royal fires, his fall from majesty to servitude, serving as a constant reminder of the futility of challenging legitimate authority. Henry VII had transformed a potential martyr into a living example of the consequences of rebellion, while simultaneously showing that he was merciful to those who had been led astray by others. Lambert Simnel lived the remainder of his life in royal service, dying sometime around 1525 as an old man whose extraordinary youth had become merely a curiosity of history. His story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of ambition and the manipulation of innocence for political ends, but it also demonstrated the remarkable fluidity of identity in late medieval England, where a baker's son could briefly convince thousands that he was their rightful king. The case established important precedents for how future pretenders would be handled. Henry VII's combination of military action, propaganda warfare, and calculated mercy created a template that would influence royal responses to dynastic challenges for generations to come. More immediately, it helped establish the Tudor dynasty's legitimacy by demonstrating that even serious military challenges could be overcome without resorting to the kind of wholesale slaughter that had characterized earlier phases of the Wars of the Kime. Roses. Perkin Warbeck. In the bustling port of Cork, where merchant ships from across Europe discharged their cargoes of wine, wool, and dreams of profit, a young Flemish apprentice walked the quayside with the easy confidence of one accustomed to commercial negotiations. His name was Pierre de Warbeck, though the Irish merchants who employed him as a cloth salesman knew him by the anglicized version, Perkin Warbeck. He was perhaps 17 years old in the autumn of 1491, handsome in the way that made elderly merchants trust him with their finest silks, intelligent enough to manage complex transactions in multiple languages. His future should have led to a comfortable life in international trade, perhaps eventually owning his own ship and warehouse. Instead, it would take him to the very pinnacle of European politics before casting him down to a traitor's death. The transformation began with a case of mistaken identity that would reshape the destiny of kingdoms. As Perkin paraded through Cork streets, wearing a particularly fine silk outfit part of his duties, as a cloth merchant and lookers began to whisper among themselves. The young man's bearing, his features, his natural grace, all suggested something more than common birth. In a region where Yorkist sympathies remained strong and legends of royal survival flourished, observers began to draw remarkable conclusions about the well-dressed stranger in their midst. Initially, the speculation focused on whether Perkin might be the illegitimate son of Richard III, but this claim lacked the emotional resonance necessary for a successful imposture. The real breakthrough came when someone suggested a far more compelling possibility. Perhaps this was Richard of Shrewsbury, Duke of York, the younger of the two princes in the Tower, whose fate remained one of England's most enduring mysteries. The suggestion should have been laughable. The princes had disappeared in 1483, 8 years earlier, and were generally assumed to have been murdered on the orders of their uncle, Richard III. But the absence of bodies or reliable witnesses to their deaths had left room for hope among those who preferred to believe in miraculous survivals rather than brutal realities. More importantly, the political situation in Europe was perfectly positioned to benefit from such a claim. Perkin's initial response to these suggestions was reportedly one of bewilderment and denial. He insisted on his true identity as a Flemish merchant's apprentice, producing what documentation he possessed to support his mundane origins. But the Irish nobles who had gathered around him were not interested in prosaic truths. They saw in this young man an opportunity to strike back at Henry Tudor, whose authority in Ireland remained tenuous and whose legitimacy was still questioned by significant portions of the English nobility. The pressure to accept the role of Richard of York came from multiple directions. Irish lords offered military support, financial backing, and the promise of international recognition if he would only acknowledge his true identity. Flemish merchants suggested that claiming royal blood might open doors that mere commercial connections could never unlock. Most persuasively, representatives of foreign courts began arriving in Cork, each offering increasingly attractive inducements if the young man would accept his supposed destiny. The final conversion of Perkin Warbeck from merchant to prince was perhaps inevitable given the forces arrayed to encourage it. Whether he genuinely came to believe in his royal identity or simply accepted it as the most profitable course available to him remains one of history's unanswered questions. What is certain is that once he embraced the role of Richard of York, He played it with a conviction and skill that would convince some of Europe's most sophisticated political minds. Margaret of Burgundy, the indomitable Dowager Duchess who had supported Lambert Simnel's earlier claim, immediately recognized Perkin as her nephew. Her endorsement carried enormous weight in European diplomatic circles, where her intelligence, network, and political acumen were legendary. With Margaret's backing, Perkin gained access to the Burgundian court, where he was treated with all the honors due to a legitimate English prince. The education of a pretender began in earnest. Perkin was schooled in English court protocol, Plantagenet family history, and the intimate details of royal life that would be necessary to sustain his claim. He learned to speak English with the refined accent of nobility, to conduct himself with royal dignity, and to project the kind of natural authority that made observers believe they were witnessing the miraculous return of a martyred prince. But Perkin's greatest asset was not his training, but his natural charisma. Contemporary accounts describe a young man of exceptional charm and intelligence, possessed of the kind of magnetic personality that drew people to him regardless of their initial skepticism. He had the rare gift of making even cynical courtiers want to believe in his story, transforming political calculation into something approaching religious faith. The international tour that followed established Perkin as a serious player in European politics. From Burgundy, he traveled to the court of Charles VIII of France, where he was received with honors typically reserved for visiting royalty. The French king, locked in perpetual rivalry with England, saw obvious advantages in supporting a pretender who might destabilize his enemy's kingdom. The Scottish phase of Perkin's career represented the high point of his international recognition. James IV of Scotland not only acknowledged him as the rightful King of England, but sealed the alliance by giving him Lady Catherine Gordon, one of Scotland's most beautiful and noble-born women, in marriage. The wedding was celebrated with appropriate royal magnificence, cementing Perkin's transformation from Flemish apprentice to internationally recognized claimant to the English throne. The military campaigns that followed revealed both the strengths and limitations of Perkin's position. His invasion attempts, while supported by foreign troops and exile English nobles, consistently failed to generate the popular uprising that successful rebellions required. The English people, whatever their private opinions about Henry Tudor's legitimacy, proved reluctant to take up arms for a prince whose identity remained questionable, and whose foreign backing made him appear more like a foreign agent than a returning king. The Cornish Rebellion of 1497 provided Perkin with his best opportunity to demonstrate that he could attract English support. Cornwall had erupted in revolt against Henry VII's taxation, and the rebels seemed natural allies for a rival claimant to the throne. When Perkin landed in Cornwall, he was initially welcomed as a liberator, his royal bearing and compelling story convincing thousands to join his cause. But the Cornwall campaign also exposed the fundamental weaknesses in Perkin's position. His foreign training and years of exile had left him poorly equipped to understand English popular sentiment. His proclamations, while eloquent, failed to address the specific grievances that had driven the Cornish to rebellion. Most fatally, when faced with approaching royal forces, his resolve crumbled, and he abandoned his supporters to seek sanctuary in Beaulieu Abbey. The capture that followed was less dramatic than pathetic. Perkin was promised safe conduct in exchange for surrender, a promise that Henry VII initially honored while he extracted maximum propaganda value from his prisoner's confession. The document that Perkin signed, acknowledging his true identity as a Flemish impostor, was distributed throughout England and Europe, designed to discredit not only the pretender himself, but the foreign courts that had supported him. For nearly 2 years, Perkin lived as a closely guarded prisoner, his presence serving as a continuing embarrassment to Henry VII's reign. The situation became untenable when the pretender, perhaps driven by desperation or residual ambition, attempted to escape from the Tower of London. This violation of the terms of his surrender provided the excuse that Henry had been seeking to resolve the problem permanently. The trial that followed was a foregone conclusion, its outcome determined by political necessity rather than legal justice. Perkin was condemned for treason and executed on November 23, 1499, at Tyburn, his death marking the end of the most successful imposture in English history. With him died the last serious Yorkist challenge to Tudor rule, finally securing Henry VII's dynasty after years of uncertainty. But Perkin Warbeck's impact extended far beyond his individual fate. His career had demonstrated the international dimensions of dynastic imposture in an age of increasing diplomatic sophistication. Unlike earlier pretenders who had operated within national boundaries, Perkin had created a pan-European movement that forced major powers to choose sides in England's succession dispute. The mystery surrounding the fate of the real princes ensured that Perkin's story would continue to fascinate historians and novelists long after his death. His case raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of identity and legitimacy that would influence how future governments dealt with similar challenges. Most importantly, his remarkable journey from apprentice to acknowledged prince illustrated the power of performance and conviction to reshape not just individual destiny, but the course of international politics. FALSO DMITRII. The winter of 1603 lay heavy across the Russian steppes, where snow fell like a shroud over a kingdom that had forgotten how to hope. In the monastery of Chudov, within the very walls of the Moscow Kremlin, a young monk named Grigory Otrepyev bent over his manuscripts in the flickering candlelight, his pen scratching across parchment with the methodical patience that monastic life demanded. But Grigory's mind was not on the holy texts he was copying. Instead, it wandered to the stories that filtered through the monastery wall-stales of the terrible Tsar Ivan IV, of his son, the gentle Dmitri, who had died so mysteriously in 1591, and of the usurper Boris Godunov, who now sat uneasily on Russia's throne. The Russian Empire in 1603 was a realm balanced on the edge of catastrophe. Tsar Boris Godunov, despite his administrative competence, ruled without the sacred legitimacy that came from Rurikid blood. His path to power had been stained by whispers of regicide, the belief that he had murdered the young Tsarevich Dmitri to clear his own route to the throne. Famine stalked the land. Foreign enemies pressed at the borders, and the boyars schemed in their palaces, waiting for any sign of weakness that might allow them to reclaim power lost to Boris's centralizing reforms. Into this atmosphere of uncertainty, Grigory Otrepyev introduced a fiction that would transform not just his own destiny, but the fate of an empire. Somewhere in the candlelit solitude of his cell, the young monk conceived a story of miraculous proportions. Prince Dmitri Ivanovich had not died in Uglitch 12 years earlier. Instead, through divine providence and loyal servants, he had escaped the assassins sent by Boris Godunov and had been living in secret, waiting for the moment when he could return to claim his rightful inheritance. The transformation of monk into prince required more than simple declaration. Grigory understood that successful imposture demanded meticulous preparation, and he possessed advantages that many pretenders lacked. His monastic education had given him literacy and learning far beyond what most nobles possessed. His position in the Chudov monastery had exposed him to court gossip and political intrigue. Most importantly, his clerical status had allowed him to study the intimate details of the Rurikid dynasty's history and customs. When Grigory finally fled the monastery in 1603, leaving behind his religious vows and his former identity, he carried with him more than just knowledge. He bore the conviction of a man who had convinced himself that his lie was actually a divine mission. The monk, who had spent years copying sacred texts, now believed that God himself had chosen him to restore the legitimate Tsarevich to Russia's throne. The journey to Poland was both a physical odyssey and a spiritual transformation. As Grigory traveled westward, he gradually shed his monastic identity and began to inhabit the persona of Prince Dmitri. By the time he reached the court of Jerzy Mniszek, one of Poland's most powerful magnates, the metamorphosis was complete. The humble monk had vanished, replaced by a young man whose regal bearing and intimate knowledge of Russian court life convinced even skeptical observers that they were witnessing the miraculous return of Ivan the Terrible's son. Polish society in the early 17th century was perfectly positioned to embrace such a claim. The nobility, educated in Renaissance humanism and Catholic theology, possessed both the sophistication to appreciate a well-crafted deception and the religious sensibility to believe in miraculous survivals. More importantly, they saw obvious strategic advantages in supporting a pretender who might destabilize their troublesome Russian neighbor. The support that crystallized around the false Dmitri was both impressive in its scope and revealing in its motivations. Polish magnates provided financial backing and military expertise, seeing in the pretender an opportunity to expand their influence eastward. Jesuit priests offered spiritual guidance and political advice, envisioning the conversion of Orthodox Russia to Catholic Christianity. Most significantly, Marina Mniszek, daughter of his principal patron, agreed to become the pretender's bride, lending aristocratic legitimacy to his increasingly credible claim. The military expedition that finally crossed into Russia in 1604 was modest in size but enormous in its implications. The army that followed the false Dmitri consisted of perhaps 3,000 men, Polish cavalry, Cossack irregulars, and Russian exiles who had embraced the pretender's cause. Against the vast resources of the Russian Empire, such a force should have been easily crushed. But numbers alone could not account for the response that greeted Dmitri's invasion. Town after town opened its gates to the advancing pretender, their inhabitants convinced that the rightful Tsar had indeed returned to claim his inheritance. The false Dmitri's knowledge of local customs and his ability to speak to common concerns won him supporters that mere military force could never have acquired. More importantly, his presence offered hope to a population that had grown weary of Boris Godunov's increasingly desperate rule. The death of Boris Godunov in April 1605 transformed what had been a dangerous rebellion into an unstoppable movement. With the usurper dead, resistance to Dmitri's claims crumbled as nobles and officials rushed to acknowledge the returning Tsarevich. The pretender's entry into Moscow was nothing short of triumphant, with crowds lining the streets to welcome their supposedly resurrected prince. The coronation that followed was magnificent in its symbolism and tragic in its implications. On July 21, 1605, in the Cathedral of the Assumption, Grigory Otrepiev was crowned as Tsar Dmitri Ivanovich, the ceremony conducted with all the sacred rituals that legitimized Muscovite rule. The monk who had fled his monastery 2 years earlier now commanded an empire that stretched from the Baltic to the Pacific, his authority seemingly confirmed by both popular acclaim and divine blessing. But the reign of the false Dmitri was built on foundations more fragile than they appeared. His Polish education and Catholic sympathies, initially assets in gaining foreign support, became liabilities once he assumed actual power. Russian boyars, initially willing to acknowledge his claims, grew increasingly uncomfortable with their Tsar's foreign influences and reformist policies. More dangerously, his marriage to Marina Mniszek in May 1606 was seen by many as confirmation that their Orthodox ruler had been corrupted by Latin heresy. The reforms that Dmitri attempted to implement revealed both his intelligence and his fatal misunderstanding of Russian political culture. His efforts to modernize the government, reduce corruption, and improve relations with the West were undoubtedly well-intentioned. But in a society where tradition and orthodox religiosity were fundamental to political legitimacy, such changes appeared to confirm the worst suspicions about their Tsar's true loyalties. The conspiracy that finally brought down the false Dmitri was led by Vasily Shchuisky, a boyar whose family had long harbored ambitions for the throne. Świecki skillfully exploited growing discontent with the Tsar's policies, painting Dmitri as a Polish agent who threatened the very soul of Orthodox Russia. The accusation that the Tsar was actually an impostor, a claim that Świecki knew to be true, provided the perfect pretext for rebellion. The palace coup of May 17, 1606 was swift and brutal. Dmitri, awakened by the sound of armed men breaking down palace doors, attempted to flee but was cornered and killed by the conspirators. His body was displayed publicly, the boyars claiming to have revealed his false hand, a supposed deformity that proved his imposture. The monk who had briefly ruled an empire died, as he had lived his final years performing a role, though this time his audience had turned fatally hostile. The immediate aftermath of Dmitri's death was chaos. Vasily Świecki claimed the throne as Vasily IV, but his authority was never fully accepted. The false Dmitri's reign had unleashed forces that no single ruler could control, beginning the period known as the Time of Troubles that would devastate Russia for nearly a decade. More broadly, the career of the false Dmitri demonstrated how effectively a skilled impostor could exploit the intersection of political ambition, religious conviction, and popular desperation. His success revealed the vulnerability of early modern states to challenges that combined foreign support with domestic legitimacy claims. Most tragically, his story illustrated how the pursuit of political power could transform even sincere religious conviction into the instrument of catastrophic deception. FALSO DMITRII II. The smoke had barely cleared from the ruins of the first false Dmitri's reign when whispers began circulating in the taverns and marketplaces of Moscow. The boyars might have killed the pretender, but they had not killed the idea he represented. In the chaos that followed Vasily Świecki's usurpation of the throne, Russia found itself gripped by a peculiar form of madness, the conviction that Prince Dmitri, like some Orthodox phoenix, could rise repeatedly from the ashes of apparent death to reclaim his rightful inheritance. The time of troubles had transformed Russia into a political laboratory where the most audacious experiments in imposture could flourish. Foreign armies marched across Russian soil, rival claimants competed for popular loyalty, and the very concept of legitimate authority seemed to dissolve in the face of competing narratives about divine will and dynastic right. In this atmosphere of uncertainty, the emergence of a second false Dmitri was perhaps inevitable. The man who would become known as the Tsar of Tushino appeared in the summer of 1607, emerging from the borderlands where Russia met Poland like a figure from legend. His origins were obscure. Some claimed he was a defrocked priest named Matveev. Others suggested he was a schoolteacher from Belarus who had carefully studied his predecessor's techniques. What was certain was that he possessed an uncanny resemblance to the first false Dmitri, suggesting either remarkable coincidence or careful selection by those who sought to profit from renewed dynastic confusion. Unlike his predecessor, the second false Dmitri never claimed to be the original pretender miraculously resurrected. Instead, his story was more subtle and, in some ways, more credible. He maintained that he was indeed Prince Dmitri, that the first pretender had been his loyal servant who had died in his place, and that he had remained in hiding until the moment was right for his true revelation. The narrative was complex enough to confuse even careful observers while providing answers to the obvious questions about how a dead man could return to life. The political situation that greeted the second pretender was even more favorable than the one his predecessor had exploited. Vasily Świecki's reign had proven even more unpopular than Boris Godunov's, while Polish intervention in Russian affairs had created widespread resentment that could be channeled against the current Tsar. Most importantly, the first false Dmitri's brief reign had established a precedent. The idea that a true Dmitri existed and could legitimately claim the throne had become embedded in popular consciousness. The military support that rallied to the second false Dmitri came primarily from the Cossacks of the Don and Volga regions. fierce warriors who had their own grievances against central authority. These were men accustomed to electing their own leaders and living by their own laws, natural allies for any pretender who promised to restore traditional Russian freedoms. Their support gave the second Dmitri a military foundation that his predecessor had sometimes lacked. The camp at Tushino, just outside Moscow, became the center of an alternative Russian government that at its height controlled territory stretching from the Baltic to the Caspian Sea. The second false Dmitri held court there with all the ceremony of a legitimate Tsar, issuing decrees, receiving foreign ambassadors, and conducting the business of statecraft with an efficiency that embarrassed Shuisky's increasingly beleaguered administration. The most remarkable aspect of the Tushino period was the extent to which it normalized the idea of competing Tsars. Russia effectively had two governments, two courts, and two sets of officials, each claiming exclusive legitimacy, while the other was dismissed as usurpation. Nobles and officials switched sides repeatedly, serving whichever claimant seemed ascendant at any given moment, creating a fluid political situation that defied traditional concepts of loyalty and treason. Marina Mnisek's recognition of the second false Dmitri as her husband added a surreal element to an already bizarre situation. The Polish noblewoman, widowed by the first pretender's death, publicly acknowledged the new claimant as her supposedly resurrected spouse, lending aristocratic credibility to his cause while raising uncomfortable questions about the nature of marital bonds. Her decision was probably motivated more by political calculation than by genuine belief, but it provided the pretender with a form of legitimacy that mere military success could not supply. The Swedish intervention that began in 1609 added yet another layer of complexity to Russia's dynastic chaos. King Charles IX of Sweden saw opportunity in Russian weakness, supporting various claimants while pursuing his own territorial ambitions in the Baltic. The result was a four-way struggle between Shuisky's government, the Tushino pretender, Polish forces, and Swedish armies, each pursuing objectives that often conflicted with their nominal allies. The decline of the second false Dmitri began when Polish support shifted toward direct annexation rather than indirect control through a puppet Tsar. The pretender's usefulness to his foreign backers diminished as they pursued more ambitious goals, leaving him increasingly isolated and dependent on Cossack forces whose loyalty was conditional and temporary. The end came in December 1610, when the second false Dmitri was murdered by one of his own Cossack followers in Kaluga. The killer's motivations remain unclear, possibly personal grievance, political calculation, or simple greed for the reward that various parties had placed on the pretender's head. Like his predecessor, the second false Dmitri died violently, his body becoming evidence of the ultimate failure of imposture to establish lasting legitimacy. But even the second pretender's death could not end the cycle of false Dimitris that had begun to define the time of troubles. The third major claimant appeared in 1611, styling himself as the son of the original pretender and Marina Mniszek. This little thief, as he was derisively known, never achieved the success of his supposed father or grandfather, but his very existence demonstrated how completely the Dmitri legend had embedded itself in Russian political culture. The third false Dmitri's career was brief and largely unsuccessful. He commanded neither the military resources nor the popular support that had sustained his predecessors, appearing more as an afterthought to the great drama of imposture than as a serious political force. His capture and execution in 1612 marked the effective end of the false Dmitri phenomenon, though scattered claimants would continue to appear for years afterward. The broader impact of these successive pretenders extended far beyond their individual failures. They had demonstrated how political chaos could create conditions where imposture became not just possible but almost inevitable. In a situation where legitimate authority had collapsed, The line between authentic and fraudulent claims to power became meaningless. All that mattered was the ability to convince followers and maintain military support. The false DMITRII also revealed the complex relationship between foreign intervention and domestic imposture in early modern Europe. Each pretender had relied heavily on external support, whether Polish, Swedish, or Cossack, but this dependence ultimately undermined their claims to represent authentic Russian interests. Their stories illustrated how imposture could become a tool of international politics, with pretenders serving as proxies for foreign powers seeking to destabilize their neighbors. Perhaps most significantly, the cycle of false DMITRII highlighted the psychological dimensions of political crisis. The repeated emergence of new pretenders suggested that Russian society had developed a genuine need to believe in the possibility of miraculous restoration. The Dmitri legend had become a form of collective therapy, offering hope that current suffering might be relieved through the return of legitimate rule. The eventual restoration of stability under Mikhail Romanov in 1613 marked the beginning of a new dynasty, but it could not erase the memory of the years when monks and schoolteachers had ruled as czars. The time of troubles had proven that in moments of extreme crisis, the traditional boundaries between reality and performance, legitimacy and imposture, could dissolve entirely, creating opportunities for the most audacious transformations in human history. SIDDIS of Janjira. The monsoon winds of 1610 carried more than rain across the Arabian Sea. They brought whispers of ambition that would transform the delicate balance of power along India's western coast. In the island fortress of Janjira, rising from the waters like a dream of impregnable stone, an African naval commander named Sidi Yakut Khan contemplated the complex game of identity and legitimacy that would define his remarkable career. The Mughal Empire sprawled across the subcontinent like a vast tapestry, its threads woven from a dozen different peoples and traditions, creating opportunities for those bold enough to reinvent themselves in the image of power. Yakut Khan belonged to that extraordinary community known as the Siddis Africans, who had arrived in India through the brutal calculus of the slave trade, but had transformed their exile into unprecedented military and political success. Unlike in other regions where African heritage marked permanent subordination, the fluid social hierarchies of medieval India allowed exceptional individuals to rise through merit, courage, and strategic alliance building. The Siddis of the Konkan coast had become master naval warriors, their fleets controlling the sea lanes that connected India to the Islamic heartlands of Arabia and East Africa. But Yakut Khan harbored ambitions that exceeded even the considerable status his naval prowess had earned him. As he walked the ramparts of Janjira, watching his ships patrol the waters that had become his domain, he conceived a story that would transform him from successful military commander into something approaching royalty. The tale he began to tell was both audacious and carefully calculated. He was not merely an African who had risen through military service, but a prince of Ethiopia, descended from the ancient rulers of Aksum, whose lineage stretched back to biblical times. The claim was not entirely without foundation. Ethiopia's Christian kingdom had long captured the imagination of the Islamic world, its rulers claiming descent from King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. These legendary connections gave Ethiopian royalty a prestige that transcended religious boundaries, making them figures of romance and respect even in Muslim courts. By positioning himself as heir to this tradition, Yakut Khan was not simply inventing a noble past, was claiming membership in one of Africa's most storied dynasties. The Mughal court's response to these claims revealed the complex dynamics of identity and status in Akbar's empire. The great emperor, architect of a syncretic state that drew strength from its diversity, was intrigued rather than skeptical when reports reached him of an African naval commander claiming Ethiopian royal blood. The Mughal system thrived on incorporating talented individuals from across the known world, and authentic Ethiopian princes would certainly qualify as valuable additions to the imperial hierarchy. Yakut Khan's supposed royal heritage was not merely decorative, it served practical political purposes that resonated throughout the complex web of Mughal administration. His claim to Ethiopian descent provided justification for his naval dominance of the Konkan coast, transforming what might have been seen as simple piracy into the legitimate exercise of royal prerogative. More importantly, it gave him standing to negotiate with Mughal officials as an equal rather than a subordinate, opening diplomatic channels that mere military success could not have created. The rituals of recognition that followed revealed the performative nature of royal identity in the early modern Indian Ocean world. Yakut Khan was received at court with honors appropriate to his claimed status, participating in ceremonies that confirmed his supposed royal blood, while demonstrating his loyalty to Mughal authority. The emperor granted him titles and privileges that acknowledged both his Ethiopian heritage and his service to the empire, creating a hybrid identity that satisfied all parties involved. But recognition from the Mughal court was only one element in a complex political equation. Yakut Khan also had to convince his rivals and neighbors of his royal status, particularly the Rajput princes and Maratha warriors who dominated the coastal regions. These were men schooled in their own ancient traditions of kingship and nobility, skeptical of upstart claims and jealous of their own prerogatives. Convincing them required a different set of strategies. The marriage alliances that Yakut Khan negotiated demonstrated his understanding of how royal status could be constructed through strategic relationships. By arranging marriages between his family and established noble houses, he created kinship networks that gradually normalized his claims to royal blood. Each alliance served as a form of peer recognition, with established families implicitly acknowledging his status by accepting matrimonial connections that would have been unthinkable with a mere military commander. The architectural program that Yakut Khan undertook at Janjira served as another form of identity construction, transforming his island fortress into a palace worthy of his claimed royal heritage. The buildings that rose under his direction combined Mughal elegance with Ethiopian motifs, creating a unique architectural statement that reinforced his narrative of African royalty adapted to Indian circumstances. Every dome and archway became an argument for his legitimacy, physical evidence of the royal status he claimed. The naval administration that developed under Yakut Khan's leadership revealed how effectively he had transformed his original identity. His fleet operated not as a collection of individual captains pursuing personal profit, but as a coordinated royal navy serving broader political objectives. This transformation from piracy to statecraft was facilitated by his claimed royal status, which provided the ideological framework necessary to justify centralized command and systematic strategy. The succession arrangements that Yakut Khan made for his descendants revealed both the success and limitations of his identity construction project. His sons inherited not just his military position, but his claimed royal status, suggesting that he had successfully established a hereditary dynasty. However, the need for constant reinforcement of these claims through marriage, military success, and court recognition demonstrated that his transformation remained provisional, dependent on continued performance rather than automatically accepted. The broader implications of Yakut Khan's career extended far beyond the specific circumstances of Sidi naval power. His story illuminated how identity functioned in the cosmopolitan world of the Mughal Empire, where successful performance could trump documented genealogy in establishing social status. The fluid boundaries between legitimate and constructed identity that characterized his era created opportunities for exceptional individuals to reinvent themselves in ways that would have been impossible in more rigid social systems. The diplomatic dimensions of Yakut Khan's imposture revealed how claims to royal status could serve as tools of international relations. His supposed Ethiopian heritage gave him credibility in negotiations with other African rulers, while his Mughal recognition provided legitimacy in dealings with Indian princes. This dual identity allowed him to serve as a bridge between different political systems, translating between African and Indian concepts of legitimacy and authority. The religious aspects of Yaqut Khan's identity construction were particularly complex, involving the navigation of Christian Ethiopian traditions, Islamic Mughal culture, and various Hindu customs encountered along the coast. His ability to maintain respectability across these different religious contexts demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of syncretism that made his imposture sustainable over decades rather than months. The legacy of Yaqut Khan's transformation extended far beyond his individual career, establishing precedents that would influence how subsequent generations of Siddis approached questions of identity and status. His success in claiming royal heritage while maintaining military effectiveness created a template that combined authentic achievement with strategic narrative construction, showing how imposture could serve not just personal ambition, but broader community advancement. Most significantly, his story revealed how the early modern Indian Ocean world functioned as a space where identity was fluid, performance was powerful, and the line between authentic and constructed royalty was often meaningless. In an empire built on diversity and adaptation, Yaqut Khan's transformation from African exile to Ethiopian prince represented not deception but successful integration into a system that valued ability over ancestry. TÚPAC AMARU. Resurrected. The morning mist clung to the ancient stones of Cusco like the ghosts of an empire that refused to die, wrapping the former Inca capital in a shroud of memory and longing. In the narrow streets where conquistadors had built their churches atop sacred temples, where Spanish merchants now hawked their wares in markets that had once fed the children of the sun, whispers began to circulate in the summer of 1620. The whispers spoke of impossible things, of the last Sapa Inca walking again among his people, of the ancient bloodline stirring to reclaim what had been lost to Spanish steel and smallpox. It had been over 40 years since Túpac Amaru I, the final independent ruler of the Inca, had met his fate in Cusco's main plaza. The Spanish, led by Viceroy Francisco de Toledo, had dragged the young emperor from his mountain refuge at Vilcabamba and executed him before a crowd of weeping native subjects. His death was meant to end the Neo-Inca state forever, to extinguish the last ember of resistance that had burned in the Andean highlands since Pizarro's arrival 8 decades earlier. But empires, like men, sometimes prove more difficult to kill than their conquerors imagine. In the remote villages scattered across the Andes, where Spanish authority thinned like mountain air, the memory of Inca rule had not faded, but transformed into something more powerful and dangerous, prophetic hope that spoke of restoration and revenge. The indigenous peoples, ground down by the encomienda system and the relentless extraction of silver for Spanish coffers, nurtured stories of their fallen emperor's eventual return. Into this landscape of suppressed longing stepped a figure whose identity remains shrouded in the mists of colonial reportage and indigenous oral tradition. Spanish documents refer to him only as the pretender or the false Inca, but among the native peoples who flocked to his banner, he was known by the name that carried the weight of empire. Túpac Amaru returned from the world of the ancestors to liberate his children from foreign oppression. The man who claimed this august identity possessed qualities that made his story credible to those who desperately wanted to believe it. He knew intimate details of Inca court ritual, spoke Quechua with the refined accent of nobility, and carried himself with the natural authority that marked true royal blood. More importantly, he understood the religious and political symbolism that could transform personal charisma into mass movement, wrapping his claims in the sacred narratives that gave meaning to Andean life. His story, as it spread through the highland communities, was perfectly crafted for its audience. He had not died in Cusco's plaza, but had been spirited away by loyal retainers at the moment of execution, another man dying in his place while the true Sapa Inca escaped to the eastern forests. There, in the impenetrable depths of the Amazon, he had waited and gathered strength, learning from the forest spirits and communing with the ancestors who promised that the time of restoration would come. The religious dimensions of his claimed return were particularly powerful in a colonial society where Christianity had been forcibly grafted onto indigenous belief systems without entirely displacing them. The pretender's narrative drew on both traditions, presenting his survival as a form of resurrection that paralleled Christian themes while maintaining connection to Andean concepts of cyclical time and divine kingship. He was both the returning Christ and the awakening Pachacutec, the world transformer who would restore the cosmic order. The response to his emergence was immediate and electric. Villages that had endured generations of Spanish exploitation suddenly found their young men disappearing into the mountains, drawn by rumors that the Sapa Inca was gathering an army for the final war of liberation. Women brought their children to see the man they believed was their rightful emperor, seeking blessings that would protect their families from Spanish oppression. The ceremonies that surrounded the pretender's court in exile revealed the sophisticated understanding of power and symbolism that made his imposture so compelling. He held audiences in caves and forest clearings decorated with the sacred symbols of Inca rule, wearing the crimson fringe of the royal lautu while seated on a throne carved from living rock. Ancient songs and dances were performed in his honor, their rhythms awakening memories that Spanish rule had tried to bury. But the pretender's greatest weapon was not ceremony but promise. He spoke of a golden age restored, when the Spanish would be driven into the sea and the natural order of the Andes would be re-established. The harsh tribute system would end, the forced labor in the mines would cease, and the children of the sun would once again live according to the laws their ancestors had given them. These were not abstract political promises, but visceral hopes that spoke to the daily suffering of colonial subjects. The Spanish response, when it came, demonstrated both the seriousness of the threat and the methods that had made their empire possible. Viceroy Diego Fernández de Córdoba mobilized substantial military forces, recognizing that even a false Inca could become a real revolution if allowed to gather sufficient momentum. The campaign that followed was characterized by the brutal efficiency that had originally conquered the Andes, with Spanish cavalry and firearms systematically hunting down the pretender's followers. The intelligence networks that the Spanish had developed over decades of colonial rule proved particularly effective in tracking the movement's leadership. Indigenous informants, whether motivated by fear, reward, or genuine loyalty to the colonial system, provided the information necessary to penetrate the pretender's security. The mountains that had sheltered the Neo-Inca state for 40 years could not protect a movement that faced enemies both external and internal. The capture came suddenly, the result of betrayal rather than military defeat. Spanish soldiers surrounded the pretender's camp in a pre-dawn raid, finding their target still asleep in the simple hut that served as his royal palace. The man who had claimed to be the returned Sapa Inca was bound with the same chains that had held his supposed predecessor, his divine authority proving powerless against steel and treachery. The trial that followed was both legal proceeding and propaganda exercise, designed to demonstrate that the colonial order could not be challenged by appeals to ancient legitimacy. The pretender was forced to confess his true identity, revealed as a provincial noble who had skillfully exploited popular desperation for his own ambitious ends. His knowledge of Inca customs was attributed to careful study rather than royal birth, his charisma dismissed as mere theatrical performance. The execution was public and deliberately symbolic, conducted in the same plaza where the original TÚPAC AMARU had died 4 decades earlier. The Spanish authorities wanted to ensure that this time there would be no doubt about the Sapa Inca's death, no room for future pretenders to claim miraculous survival. The pretender's body was displayed for days, irrefutable proof that the dream of restoration had ended in the same bloody reality that had claimed his supposed predecessor. But even in death, the false TÚPAC AMARU had accomplished something that military conquest alone could not achieve. His movement had demonstrated the enduring power of Inca symbolism to inspire resistance, showing future rebels how ancient identities could be mobilized against colonial oppression. The Spanish might have killed the man, but they could not destroy the idea. He represented the belief that foreign rule was temporary and that the true children of the Andes would someday reclaim their inheritance. The suppression of the movement was followed by intensified efforts to eliminate the cultural foundations that had made the imposture possible. Spanish authorities banned Inca ceremonies, confiscated royal regalia, and prohibited the teaching of indigenous histories that might inspire future rebellions. These measures revealed both the regime's fear of Inca symbolism and its recognition that identity itself had become a weapon in the struggle for colonial control. The memory of the pretender's brief reign would influence subsequent indigenous movements throughout the colonial period and beyond. Future rebels would invoke his name alongside that of the original TÚPAC, AMARU, creating a lineage of resistance that stretched from the conquest to independence. His story became part of the hidden history that sustained Andean communities through centuries of oppression, proof that even the most carefully constructed colonial order could be challenged by those who remembered what had been lost. Most significantly, the case revealed how colonialism created the conditions for its own subversion, generating the very desperation and cultural dislocation that made imposture both possible and necessary. In destroying the original Inca political system, the Spanish had inadvertently transformed it into something more dangerous, a symbol of liberation that could inspire resistance long after the reality of indigenous rule had been forgotten. George Salmanazar. The coffee houses of early 18th century London buzzed with intellectual ferment, their smoky chambers filled with gentlemen eager to debate the latest discoveries from the expanding world beyond Europe's shores. In this atmosphere of curiosity and credulous wonder, where exotic tales competed for attention with serious scholarly discourse, a young man with pale skin and remarkably blue eyes began to tell stories that would captivate the most sophisticated minds of the age. He called himself George Salmanazar, claimed to be a native of the mysterious island of Formosa, and possessed a talent for invention that would make him one of history's most audacious cultural impostors. The real identity of the man who became Salmanazar remains one of literature's enduring mysteries. He was almost certainly European, probably French, and had received enough education to understand the classical languages and scholarly methods that would make his deception so convincing. But everything else about his origins, his family, his birthplace, his early life, vanished behind the elaborate fiction he constructed with such meticulous care that it fooled some of England's greatest minds for years. The Formosa that Salmanazar described to his fascinated London audiences was a marvel of ethnographic imagination, a fully realized civilization, complete with its own language, religion, customs, and history. According to his account, the island's inhabitants worshipped the sun and moon, practiced ritual human sacrifice, and lived in underground houses to protect themselves from the dragons that roamed the surface. Their alphabet consisted of 20 letters, their calendar followed a complex astronomical system, and their society was organized according to principles that seemed both exotic and strangely rational. The timing of Salmanazar's emergence was perfect for maximum impact. The early 1700s marked the height of European fascination with distant lands and foreign peoples, as trade and exploration brought back tantalizing glimpses of civilizations that seemed to operate according to entirely different principles. Scholarly societies competed to catalogue and understand these discoveries, while popular audiences devoured travel narratives with an appetite that publishers rushed to satisfy. More importantly, Formosa itself occupied a unique position in European geographical knowledge. The island was known to exist. Dutch and Portuguese traders had encountered it, but reliable information about its interior and indigenous peoples remained scarce and contradictory. This gap in authoritative knowledge created the perfect space for Salmanazar's invention, allowing him to fill the void with a civilization that was exotic enough to be believable, yet detailed enough to appear scholarly. The conversion story that Salmanazar told was crafted to appeal to Protestant sensibilities while explaining his presence in London. According to his narrative, he had been kidnapped by Jesuit missionaries who forced him to convert to Christianity and brought him to Europe for education. However, he had subsequently encountered a more enlightened form of Protestant theology that had opened his eyes to the true nature of divine revelation. His presence in England was thus both an escape from Catholic oppression and a testament to the superior appeal of Anglican Christianity. The linguistic component of Salmanazar's deception was perhaps its most impressive element. He had invented an entire language for Formosa, complete with grammar, vocabulary, and writing system. The Formosan alphabet he taught to curious scholars was elegant and systematic, while the language itself followed consistent phonological rules that made it appear authentic to those unfamiliar with genuine Asian languages. His ability to speak and write in this invented tongue with apparent fluency convinced many observers that they were witnessing a genuine linguistic phenomenon. The religious practices that Salmanazar described for his fictional homeland were carefully calibrated to intrigue Christian audiences while confirming their prejudices about pagan societies. The Formosan worship of celestial bodies, the elaborate sacrificial rituals, and the complex priestly hierarchy he detailed were exotic enough to seem genuinely foreign, while familiar enough to be comprehensible. His descriptions of religious festivals and ceremonies were particularly vivid, creating a sense of ethnographic authenticity that impressed even skeptical scholars. The royal court of Formosa, as Salmanazar described it, was a fascinating blend of Oriental despotism and rational administration. The island's ruler, he claimed, commanded absolute loyalty from his subjects while governing according to ancient laws that emphasized justice and social harmony. The elaborate court ceremonies, the hierarchical social structure, and the complex diplomatic protocols he detailed created an image of a sophisticated civilization that European audiences found both credible and compelling. The botanical and zoological details that Salmanazar provided about Formosa demonstrated his understanding of how specific information could lend credibility to larger claims. He described unique plants and animals, explained their roles in Formosan society, and even provided illustrations that appeared to be based on direct observation. These seemingly minor details were crucial to his success, as they provided the kind of concrete evidence that scholars expected from authentic travel accounts. The publication of An Historical and Geographical Description of Formosa in 1704 marked the height of Salmanazar's influence and the beginning of his eventual downfall. The book was an immediate sensation, praised by critics and devoured by readers eager to learn about this remarkable civilization. However, its very success also attracted the attention of genuine scholars who began to examine his claims with increasing skepticism. The first cracks in Salmanazar's story appeared when Catholic missionaries who had actually lived in Asia began to question his descriptions. Their direct experience with Asian cultures allowed them to identify inconsistencies and impossibilities in his account that had escaped other observers. More damaging still were the challenges from scholars who possessed genuine knowledge of Asian languages and customs, exposing errors that revealed the artificial nature of his Formosan civilization. The gradual erosion of Salmanazar's credibility was accelerated by his own psychological exhaustion. Maintaining such an elaborate deception required constant vigilance and perfect consistency, demands that eventually proved unsustainable. As questions multiplied and contradictions accumulated, his responses became increasingly defensive and unconvincing, undermining the confident authority that had originally made his claims so compelling. The confession that finally came was both relief and tragedy for a man who had painted himself into an impossible corner. In later life, Salmanazar admitted the entire deception, revealing the extent of his fabrication while providing remarkable insights into the psychology of imposture. His honesty about his dishonesty became a form of redemption, transforming him from a figure of ridicule into an object of fascination for those interested in the nature of truth and fiction. The broader implications of Salmanazar's case extended far beyond the individual tragedy of a failed impostor. His success in deceiving some of Europe's most learned men revealed the limitations of Enlightenment scholarship when confronted with skillful fabrication. The incident forced a re-evaluation of how knowledge was validated and transmitted, contributing to the development of more rigorous methods for authenticating travel accounts and ethnographic descriptions. The legacy of Salmanazar's Formosa lived on in the travel literature and ethnographic writing that followed his exposure. His detailed descriptions of an imaginary civilization provided a template that influenced how subsequent travelers and scholars approached the description of foreign cultures. Even after his confession, elements of his fictional Formosa continued to appear in European writing about Asia, demonstrating the persistence of plausible fabrication in the absence of reliable alternatives. Most significantly, Salmanazar's story illuminated the complex relationship between European curiosity about the wider world and the willingness to accept exotic narratives that confirmed existing prejudices about foreign peoples. His success revealed how the age of exploration had created an appetite for the marvelous that sometimes overwhelmed critical judgment, making European audiences complicit in their own deception. Emelian Pugachev. The autumn wind swept across the endless steppes of the Don Cossack country in 1773, carrying with it the scent of burning grass and the distant promise of winter. In a modest hut near the banks of the great river that had given the region its name, a weathered veteran of Russia's wars sat contemplating a deception so audacious that it would shake the foundations of Catherine II's empire. His name was Emelian Ivanovich Pugachev, and though he had been born to the saddle and the saber like countless other Cossacks, destiny had chosen him for a role that would transform him from simple horseman into the proclaimed emperor of all the Russias. Pugachev's early life had followed the familiar pattern of Cossack existence: military service, raids along the Ottoman frontier, the hard-won experience of men who lived between worlds and owed allegiance to no authority save their own elected leaders. He had fought in the 7 Years' War and the First Russo-Turkish conflict, earning the kind of battlefield knowledge that made him valuable to his commanders and respected by his fellows. But somewhere in the campaigns and skirmishes that had shaped his youth, Pugachev had absorbed lessons that extended beyond military tactics to encompass the darker arts of leadership and manipulation. The political situation that confronted Pugachev in 1773 was ripe with the kind of contradictions that ambitious men could exploit. Catherine II, despite her enlightened reputation and correspondence with Voltaire, ruled an empire built on the suffering of millions of serfs whose bondage had only deepened during her reign. The Cossacks, those frontier warriors who had once enjoyed relative freedom in exchange for military service, found their traditional privileges under assault from a government determined to bring all subjects under centralized control. More troubling still were the persistent rumors about the death of Tsar Peter III, Catherine's husband, whose brief reign had ended mysteriously in 1762 after his wife's coup brought her to power. The official story claimed that Peter had died of natural causes while in custody, but whispers suggested murder, and the absence of a public viewing of the body had left room for doubt. In the taverns and marketplaces of the empire's frontier regions, people spoke in hushed tones about the possibility that the legitimate Tsar still lived, waiting for the moment when he could reclaim his stolen throne. Pugachev understood the power of these whispers better than most. He had observed how the false Demetrius of the previous century had exploited similar uncertainties, transforming popular dissatisfaction into mass rebellion through the simple expedient of claiming royal identity. The Cossack veteran possessed the military experience, the natural charisma, and the desperate audacity necessary to attempt something similar. All he needed was the right moment and the perfect story. The transformation began gradually, almost tentatively, as Pugachev tested the reaction of his fellows to increasingly bold claims about his true identity. At first, he merely hinted that he knew secrets about the late Tsar's fate, suggesting that the official story of Peter III's death contained significant omissions. But as he gauged the response of his audiences, noting how eagerly they embraced the possibility of royal survival, his claims became more explicit and more personal. The story that finally emerged was masterfully crafted for its intended audience. Pugachev claimed to be Peter III himself, miraculously preserved from his wife's assassination attempt through the loyalty of faithful servants who had spirited him away to safety. He had spent 11 years in hiding among the Cossacks, learning to understand the suffering of his people while preparing for the moment when he could emerge to reclaim his rightful throne and restore justice to the empire. The physical transformation that accompanied this claim was remarkable in its attention to detail. Pugachev adopted the bearing and mannerisms he believed appropriate to royalty, speaking with the authority of one born to command, while demonstrating knowledge of court life that seemed to validate his extraordinary assertions. More importantly, he understood how to present himself as the kind of Tsar his audiences wanted, a ruler who would govern for the common people rather than the nobility, who would restore traditional freedoms rather than impose foreign innovations. The response to Pugachev's revelation was immediate and overwhelming. Cossack communities that had chafed under government restrictions rushed to acknowledge their returned Tsar, bringing with them the military skills and equipment necessary to transform a regional uprising into a genuine threat to imperial authority. The Don and Volga regions erupted in rebellion as news of Peter III's resurrection spread like wildfire across the steppe. The religious dimensions of Pugachev's imposture were crucial to its success among the Orthodox masses who formed the backbone of his movement. He presented his survival and return in providential terms, suggesting that God himself had preserved the rightful Tsar to serve as an instrument of divine justice. This religious framework transformed political rebellion into something approaching holy war, with Pugachev's followers fighting not just for their temporal interests but for cosmic righteousness. The administrative structure that developed around Pugachev's movement demonstrated his understanding of how authentic governance could legitimize revolutionary claims. He established a court complete with ministers, secretaries, and military commanders, issuing manifestos and decrees with all the formality that characterized legitimate imperial administration. His chancellery produced documents that mimicked official style, while promising the radical reforms that his supporters demanded. The manifestos that Pugachev issued in the name of Peter III were revolutionary in their scope and implications. He promised to abolish serfdom, eliminate the military service obligations that had devastated peasant families, and restore the traditional privileges of Cossack communities. Most radically, he declared that the land belonged to those who worked it, rather than to the nobles who claimed ownership through imperial grant. These promises transformed economic grievances into political revolution, giving his movement an ideological foundation that mere military success could not provide. The siege of Orenburg in the winter of 1773-74 marked the high point of Pugachev's rebellion, and the moment when his movement attracted serious imperial attention. The fortress city, key to Russian control of the southern frontier, found itself surrounded by an army that fought with the desperate courage of men who believed they were restoring legitimate authority. The siege demonstrated that Pugachev's forces possessed not just numbers but the organizational capacity necessary to sustain complex military operations. The international implications of the rebellion became apparent as foreign observers recognized the threat it posed to European stability. A successful peasant revolution in Russia might inspire similar uprisings elsewhere, challenging the social order that kept the common people subordinate to their betters. Diplomatic reports from St. Petersburg, Petersburg painted increasingly alarming pictures of an empire convulsed by popular rebellion, its very survival in doubt. Catherine II's response revealed both the seriousness of the threat and the resources that autocracy could mobilize when its survival was at stake. Regular army units were recalled from the Turkish front. Experienced generals were dispatched to the troubled regions, and a systematic campaign of suppression was launched with the full weight of imperial authority. The rebellion that had seemed unstoppable gradually found itself confronted by professional military force that peasant enthusiasm could not overcome. The betrayal that finally brought down Pugachev was characteristic of the internal contradictions that plagued his movement. Some of his own Cossack followers, either from genuine disillusionment or hope of imperial favor, delivered their leader to government forces in September 1774. The man who had briefly ruled territories larger than most European kingdoms found himself caged like a wild animal, his imperial pretensions reduced to the chains that bound him for transport to Moscow. The trial that followed was both legal proceeding and propaganda exercise, designed to demonstrate that even the most successful rebellion could not challenge autocratic authority. Pugachev was forced to confess his imposture before being sentenced to the traditional punishment for treason quartering, followed by beheading. His execution in January 1775 was witnessed by thousands, a public demonstration that the age of pretenders had ended in the triumph of legitimate government. But the legacy of Pugachev's rebellion extended far beyond his individual fate. The uprising had revealed the depth of popular discontent in Catherine's empire, forcing recognition that enlightened despotism could not address the fundamental contradictions of Russian society. The government's response included not just repression but reform, as officials recognized that some concessions were necessary to prevent future explosions of popular rage. More broadly, Pugachev's career demonstrated how imposture could serve as a vehicle for genuine social revolution, transforming personal ambition into mass movement through the powerful appeal of restored legitimacy. His story revealed the persistent power of traditional monarchy to inspire resistance, even as it showed how that power could be appropriated by those who understood its symbolic importance. The Cossack who had claimed to be Tsar had briefly made himself something far more dangerous, the voice of an empire's dispossessed masses, demanding justice in the name of their rightful king. Karl Wilhelm Naundorff. The gaslight flickered uncertainly through the windows of a modest clockmaker's shop in the Prussian city of Spandau, casting dancing shadows across the workbench where delicate mechanisms ticked away the hours of 1830s Europe. Behind the counter, a man of middle years bent over the intricate gears of a pocket watch, his skilled fingers coaxing precision from brass and steel with the patience that his trade demanded. To his neighbors, he was simply Karl Wilhelm Naundorff, a craftsman whose talent with timepieces had earned him a respectable place in their community. But the identity he claimed in letters sent across the continent was far grander and more tragique. Insisted he was Louis Charles, the lost Dauphin of France, rightful heir to the throne of the Bourbon dynasty. The story of the boy who had supposedly died in the Temple prison during the Terror remained one of Europe's most haunting mysteries. The son of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, the child who should have become Louis XVII, had vanished into the chaos of revolutionary France. His fate officially recorded as death from illness, but surrounded by enough uncertainty to fuel decades of speculation. In the aftermath of Napoleon's final defeat and the Bourbon Restoration, pretenders claiming to be the lost prince had emerged across Europe, each telling stories of miraculous escape and hidden survival that appealed to royalist sentiment and romantic imagination. Naundorff's version of these events was both more detailed and more plausible than most of his competitors. According to his carefully constructed narrative, the real Louis Charles had indeed been spirited away from the temple by loyal servants who substituted another child in his place. The prince had been raised in secret, his true identity concealed even from himself until circumstances finally allowed the revelation of his royal birth. The years of exile and hardship had transformed the pampered Dauphin into a man of practical skills and humble demeanor, explaining both his clockmaking abilities and his apparent lack of courtly refinement. The timing of Naundorf's emergence could hardly have been more propitious. The July Revolution of 1830 had toppled the restored Bourbon monarchy of Charles X, replacing it with the more liberal regime of Louis Philippe, the citizen king, whose own claims to legitimacy were disputed by traditional royalists. In this atmosphere of dynastic uncertainty, the appearance of a potential Bourbon heir represented both opportunity and threat, attracting the attention of legitimist circles across Europe, who saw in him either salvation or dangerous delusion. The evidence that Naundorf presented to support his claims was remarkably comprehensive, suggesting either genuine authenticity or extraordinarily thorough preparation. He possessed detailed knowledge of court life at Versailles, intimate family secrets that should have been known only to the royal family, and physical characteristics that seemed to match contemporary descriptions of the young Louis Charles. More compellingly, he bore vaccination scars in locations that corresponded to medical records of the Dauphin's treatment, and his handwriting showed similarities to surviving samples of the prince's childish script. The investigation that followed Naundorf's claims was unprecedented in its scope and rigor, involving some of Europe's most distinguished legal minds and utilizing techniques that prefigured modern forensic science. Handwriting experts compared his letters to authenticated royal documents. Physicians examined his physical characteristics against contemporary medical records, and historians tested his knowledge of court customs and family relationships. The results were tantalizingly inconclusive, with evidence supporting his claims balanced by inconsistencies that suggested careful fabrication rather than authentic memory. The legal proceedings that Naundorf initiated in French courts represented one of the first systematic attempts to establish royal identity through judicial process rather than armed force or popular acclaim. His lawsuit against the French state, demanding recognition as the rightful heir and compensation for the seized royal patrimony, forced the government to examine questions of dynastic succession and identity that had previously been settled by political power rather than legal argument. The testimony of surviving members of the royal household proved particularly significant in evaluating Naundorf's claims. Servants who had known the young Louis Charles, courtiers who had observed the royal family during the Revolution, and officials who had been present during the prince's imprisonment were called upon to identify or reject the middle-aged clockmaker who claimed to be their former master. Their responses were divided, with some expressing genuine conviction that they recognized the lost Dauphin, while others dismissed him as an obvious impostor. The international dimensions of Naundorf's case revealed how questions of royal legitimacy had become matters of diplomatic concern in post-Napoleonic Europe. His claims were taken seriously enough to attract the attention of foreign governments, with some continental monarchies expressing cautious support, while others worried about the precedent that might be established if pretenders could successfully claim thrones through legal proceedings rather than traditional succession. The religious aspects of the controversy proved particularly complex, involving questions about the relationship between divine right monarchy and earthly verification of identity. Catholic legitimists argued that God would not allow a false claimant to possess such detailed knowledge of royal life, while critics countered that divine providence might equally well preserve the true prince from making such claims if they were authentic. These theological debates revealed how deeply questions of royal imposture were embedded in broader arguments about the nature of political authority. The scientific methods that began to be applied to royal identity cases during this period marked a significant evolution in how such claims were evaluated. Phrenological examinations of skull structure, comparative analysis of portraits and photographs, and systematic documentation of physical characteristics represented early attempts to bring objective standards to questions that had previously been resolved through political or social consensus. The Netherlands became Naundorf's final refuge when French courts ultimately rejected his claims, though the decision was based more on political expediency than conclusive evidence of imposture. The Dutch authorities, perhaps influenced by diplomatic considerations or genuine uncertainty about his identity, allowed him to settle in Delft under the name Louis XVII, effectively acknowledging his royal claims while avoiding the international complications that formal recognition might have created. The death of Naundorff in 1845 should have ended the controversy, but instead it transformed the legal question into a genealogical mystery that would persist for another century and a half. His descendants continued to press his claims through successive generations, maintaining their own royal court in exile and pursuing legal recognition in various European jurisdictions. The persistence of their efforts reflected both genuine conviction and the considerable financial interests that rode on questions of Bourbon inheritance. The scientific revolution that transformed identity verification in the late 20th century finally provided tools capable of resolving questions that had puzzled earlier generations. DNA analysis, comparing genetic material from Naundorff's remains with authenticated samples from the Bourbon family line, definitively established that the clockmaker was not the lost Louis Charles. The tests revealed that he was almost certainly of Germanic rather than French ancestry, conclusively disproving claims that had been debated for over a century and a half. The psychological portrait that emerged from the extensive documentation of Naundorff's case provided unprecedented insight into the mind of a royal pretender. His apparent genuine conviction about his identity, evidenced by decades of consistent behavior and the substantial personal costs he incurred in pursuing his claims, suggested either remarkable acting ability or some form of delusional belief that had evolved into unshakable certainty. The broader implications of Naundorff's story extended far beyond the specific question of his identity to encompass fundamental issues about how societies establish and verify truth. His case marked a transition from an era when identity was largely a matter of social recognition to one where scientific evidence could provide objective verification. The evolution from testimony-based to DNA-based identification represented a profound shift in how human societies approached questions of lineage and inheritance. The literary and cultural legacy of the Naundorff case proved remarkably enduring, inspiring novels, plays, and historical studies that explored themes of identity, legitimacy, and the relationship between personal conviction and objective truth. His story became a template for examining how individuals could convince themselves and others of extraordinary claims, while also revealing how institutional authorities adapted their methods of verification to meet new challenges. Most significantly, the case illuminated the complex psychology of post-revolutionary European society, where the trauma of the French Revolution had created both a longing for legitimate monarchy and a deep suspicion of traditional authority. Naundorff's claims appealed to those who sought restoration of the old order, while simultaneously challenging the very foundations upon which that order had been built. His story revealed how the modern world's relationship with monarchy had become simultaneously more sentimental and more skeptical, more scientific and more mystical than anything previous generations had experienced. John Nichols Thom. The chalk downs of Kent rolled away toward the horizon like a sea of ancient green, dotted with sheep and crossed by roads that had carried travelers since Roman times. In the village of Barton, where the medieval church tower watched over cottages that seemed to grow from the very soil, the spring of 1834 brought whispers of a man whose extraordinary claims would soon transform him from rural curiosity into the center of one of Victorian England's strangest episodes of mass delusion and violent tragedy. John Nichols Thom had arrived in the county as a maltster, one of those essential craftsmen who transformed barley into the raw material for England's beer. His trade was ancient and honorable, his skills valuable in a society where ale was safer to drink than water and more nutritious than much of what passed for food among the laboring classes. But Thom harbored grievances that ran deeper than professional dissatisfaction. nursing resentments against a system that seemed designed to keep men of talent in their ordained stations, regardless of their capabilities or aspirations. The economic upheavals of the 1830s had created perfect conditions for the kind of social unrest that ambitious men could exploit. Agricultural communities across southern England faced displacement as ancient farming methods gave way to more efficient but less labor-intensive practices. The Reform Act of 1832 had raised expectations of political change, while delivering benefits primarily to the middle classes, leaving rural workers feeling betrayed by promises of improvement that had not materialized. Into this atmosphere of frustration and disappointed hope, Tom introduced a persona that would appeal to the deepest longings of the dispossessed. The transformation began gradually, almost imperceptibly, as Tom started to present himself with an authority that seemed to exceed his humble station. He spoke with increasing confidence about political and religious matters, displaying knowledge that impressed his audiences while hinting at connections and experiences that a simple maltster should not have possessed. His bearing became more regal, his voice more commanding, and his clothing more elegant as he gradually introduced the extraordinary claim that would define his brief, tragic career. The identity that Tom finally adopted was perfectly calculated to appeal to popular prejudices and romantic longings. He announced that he was Sir William Percy Honeywood Courtenay, Knight of Malta, King of Jerusalem, and rightful heir to the throne of England. The name was not entirely fabricated. A real Sir William Courtenay existed, though he was safely ensconced in his legitimate life, far from Kent. But the false Courtenay's claims extended far beyond simple identity theft to encompass a mystical authority that combined royal blood with divine appointment. The religious dimensions of Tom's imposture were crucial to his success among rural audiences who had been raised on biblical stories of miraculous revelations and divine interventions in human affairs. He claimed to be not just a temporal king but a spiritual savior, sent by God to liberate the poor from their oppression and establish a kingdom of justice on earth. His sermons blended Christian theology with social reform, promising his followers that their current suffering would be transformed into eternal glory when his true identity was recognized and his rightful authority restored. The performance that Tom delivered in support of these claims was extraordinary in its attention to detail and psychological sophistication. He carried himself with genuine regal dignity, spoke with the educated accent of the aristocracy, and demonstrated knowledge of heraldry, genealogy, and court protocol that seemed to validate his extraordinary assertions. More importantly, he possessed the kind of magnetic charisma that made even skeptical observers want to believe in his impossible story. The countryside of Kent provided an ideal theatre for Tom's royal performance. Rural communities, isolated from the rapid changes transforming urban England, retained traditional reverence for monarchy while harboring deep suspicions about the legitimacy of current authority. The legend of the once and future king, who would return to restore England's ancient glory, resonated powerfully among people who felt abandoned by their actual rulers and betrayed by the promises of political reform. The movement that crystallized around the false Sir William Courtenay attracted followers from across the spectrum of rural society. Agricultural laborers facing unemployment, small farmers threatened by economic change, and village craftsmen displaced by industrial production all found hope in his message of restoration and revenge. Their desperate circumstances made them receptive to claims that would have been dismissed by more prosperous audiences, while their traditional deference to authority predisposed them to accept royal commands once they had been convinced of his legitimacy. The prophetic elements that Tom incorporated into his message were particularly effective in maintaining follower loyalty as external pressure mounted. He claimed to possess supernatural knowledge about future events, predicting that armies of angels would soon descend to support his cause. while the powers of darkness that supported false authority would be swept away in divine judgment. These prophecies provided explanation for any setbacks his movement encountered, while maintaining hope that ultimate victory was inevitable. The attention of local authorities was initially dismissive rather than alarmed, with magistrates and constables treating Tom as a harmless madman whose pretensions would collapse once he encountered serious opposition. This underestimation of both his psychological hold over his followers and his willingness to resort to violence would prove tragically mistaken. The rural gentry who governed Kent had little experience with the kind of charismatic leadership that could transform economic grievance into religious fanaticism. The confrontation that finally brought the imposture to its violent conclusion began when Tom led a small band of followers in what he characterized as a royal progress through the Kentish countryside. This armed march, ostensibly peaceful but implicitly threatening, represented a direct challenge to established authority that could not be ignored. The local magistrates, finally recognizing the seriousness of the situation, called upon military assistance to arrest the pretender and disperse his supporters. The fatal encounter occurred on Bossenden Wood on May 31, 1838, when Tom's followers, believing their leader's promises of divine protection, confronted a small force of soldiers sent to arrest him. The false Sir William Courtenay, dressed in his assumed regalia and carrying the sword he claimed had been blessed by heavenly powers, led his followers into a hopeless battle that ended with his death and the destruction of his movement. The aftermath of Bossenden Wood was marked by the kind of moralizing commentary that Victorian society applied to events that challenged its assumptions about progress and rationality. Newspaper accounts portrayed Tom as a dangerous madman who had exploited the ignorance and superstition of rural folk, while his followers were depicted as victims of their own credulity rather than as rational actors responding to genuine grievances. The investigation that followed revealed the complex psychological and social factors that had made Tom's imposture possible. His ability to convince educated observers, as well as simple laborers, suggested that his charisma transcended class boundaries, while the persistence of his followers' loyalty, even after his death, indicated that his message had addressed real needs that legitimate authority had failed to meet. The medical examination of Tom's behavior and claims introduced early Victorian concepts of mental illness into discussions of royal imposture, suggesting that his delusions might have been the product of disease rather than conscious deception. This psychiatric interpretation provided a more comfortable explanation than the alternative possibility that rational people might choose to follow pretenders who offered more appealing visions of authority than legitimate rulers could provide. The broader implications of the Courtenay case extended far beyond the specific circumstances of rural Kent to encompass fundamental questions about the relationship between traditional authority and popular consent in an era of rapid social change. Tom's ability to convince followers that he was their rightful king revealed how fragile the bonds of legitimate authority could become when they failed to address the needs and aspirations of ordinary people. The literary and cultural legacy of John Nichol's Tom proved remarkably durable, inspiring fictional treatments that explored themes of imposture, charisma, and the intersection of mental illness with political delusion. His story became a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked authority and the vulnerability of rural communities to manipulation by skilled demagogues. Most significantly, the case marked an important transition in how British society understood and responded to challenges to established authority. The combination of military force and medical explanation that was applied to Tom's movement established precedents that would influence how future governments dealt with similar challenges, while his story revealed the persistent appeal of monarchical authority, even in an age that was supposedly moving toward more democratic forms of governance. Caspar Hauser. The cobblestones of Nuremberg's Unschlittplatz gleamed with evening dew on Whit Monday, 1828, when a figure emerged from the gathering dusk, that would transform the quiet Bavarian city into the center of one of Europe's most enduring mysteries. The young man who appeared before the shoemaker Georg Weichmann walked with the uncertain gait of one unaccustomed to urban streets, his clothes simple but well-made, his manner suggesting both innocence and bewilderment. In his hand he clutched a letter that would introduce him to the world as Kaspar Hauser, but the questions surrounding his identity would puzzle investigators, philosophers, and romantics for generations to come. The letter itself was a masterpiece of calculated ambiguity, written in a style that suggested both education and deliberate obscurity. It claimed that the bearer was approximately 16 years old, had been raised in complete isolation by a mysterious guardian who had recently died, and possessed no knowledge of his true parentage or origins. The document requested that the authorities care for the youth, hinting that his background might be more significant than his current circumstances suggested, while providing no concrete information that could be verified or disproven. Kaspar's behavior upon his discovery seemed to confirm the extraordinary claims made in his letter. He spoke only a few words of German, appeared unfamiliar with common foods and social customs, and reacted to new experiences with the wonder of one encountering civilization for the first time. His apparent inability to lie, combined with his natural grace and intelligence, created an impression of innocence that enchanted observers accustomed to the calculated sophistication of ordinary social interaction. The Romantic movement that dominated early 19th century European culture was perfectly positioned to embrace Kaspar's story as validation of its fundamental beliefs about human nature and social development. Here was a natural man who had supposedly grown to adolescence without exposure to the corrupting influences of civilization, a living embodiment of Rousseau's theories about the innate goodness of humanity. Philosophers, poets, and political theorists flocked to Nuremberg to observe this remarkable specimen and draw conclusions about the relationship between nature and nurture in human development. The initial investigations into Kaspar's background were hampered by his apparent inability to provide coherent information about his past. His memories, as he gradually learned to articulate them, painted a picture of years spent in a dark chamber with only a wooden horse for companionship, visited periodically by a mysterious figure who provided food and water but no human contact. The story was both heartbreaking and incredible, generating sympathy for the supposed victim while raising obvious questions about its plausibility. The physical evidence surrounding Kaspar's case was frustratingly inconclusive, providing enough support for various theories to keep controversy alive while offering definitive proof of none. His soft hands suggested a life without manual labor. His pale complexion indicated limited exposure to sunlight, and his apparent unfamiliarity with common objects seemed consistent with extreme isolation. However, skeptics noted that these characteristics could equally well be explained by careful preparation rather than genuine deprivation. The linguistic analysis of Kaspar's speech patterns provided some of the most intriguing clues about his possible origins. As his German improved, philologists detected traces of what might have been other languages, possibly Hungarian or another Central European tongue. These linguistic fragments, combined with his apparent nobility of bearing, fueled speculation that he might be of aristocratic birth, hidden away to prevent him from claiming some significant inheritance or political position. The theories about Kaspar's royal identity began to coalesce around the possibility that he was the lost crown prince of Baden, supposedly dead, but perhaps hidden away through some palace conspiracy. The Grand Duchy of Baden had experienced succession controversies that might have provided motive for such drastic action, while the timing of Kaspar's appearance coincided suspiciously with political developments that could have made his emergence strategically significant. The investigation into the Baden connection was conducted with all the thoroughness that early 19th century detective work could provide. Court records were examined, genealogies were traced, and surviving witnesses were questioned about their memories of the royal family's domestic arrangements. The results were tantalizing but inconclusive, with some evidence supporting the theory, while other facts seemed to contradict it. The attempts to educate Caspar and integrate him into civilized society provided unprecedented opportunities to observe how a supposedly natural human being might adapt to social conventions and intellectual challenges. His rapid progress in learning to read and write seemed to confirm theories about innate human intelligence, while his artistic abilities and musical sensibilities suggested an inherent refinement that supported claims about his noble birth. The attack on Caspar in 1829, when he was found wounded and claimed to have been stabbed by a mysterious assailant, added a new dimension of danger and intrigue to his story. The incident could be interpreted as either evidence that powerful enemies sought to silence him, or as a staged event designed to maintain public interest in his case. The ambiguity was characteristic of everything surrounding Caspar's life, where every development seemed to support multiple interpretations. The final tragedy came in December 1833, when Caspar was found dying from stab wounds in the Hofgarten at Ansbach, claiming with his last breath that he had been attacked by a man who had given him a silk purse. The murder eliminated the primary source of information about his true identity, while creating a martyrdom that ensured his story would outlive any possibility of definitive resolution. The investigation of Caspar's death was as inconclusive as every other aspect of his case, with evidence pointing toward both suicide and murder, while proving neither conclusively. The silk purse he supposedly received from his attacker was found to contain a cryptic note written in mirror writing, adding yet another layer of mystery to an already baffling case. The posthumous examination of Caspar's brain, conducted according to the phrenological theories popular at the time, was intended to provide scientific evidence about his mental capabilities and possible noble heritage. The results, predictably, were interpreted differently by various experts, with some claiming to find evidence of exceptional intelligence while others detected signs of mental deficiency or deliberate deception. The documentary evidence that emerged after Caspar's death included claims by various individuals who professed to know secrets about his true identity. But these revelations were typically as ambiguous and unverifiable as everything else connected with his case. Letters appeared, claiming to reveal the truth about royal conspiracies, but their authenticity was always questionable, and their contents raised more questions than they answered. The scientific revolution of the late 20th century finally provided tools that earlier investigators had lacked, making possible DNA analysis of hair samples and other physical evidence associated with Caspar's case. The results of these tests, conducted in the 1990s, seemed to disprove the Baden theory, while raising new questions about his actual origins. However, even these scientific findings were disputed, with critics questioning the reliability of degraded genetic material and the validity of the testing procedures. The psychological interpretations of Caspar's case evolved significantly over time, reflecting changing understanding of mental illness, child development, and the effects of extreme isolation on human development. Modern analysts have suggested various explanations ranging from autism spectrum disorders to elaborate hoaxes, while others continue to argue for the basic authenticity of his reported experiences. The cultural legacy of Caspar Hauser proved remarkably enduring, inspiring literary works, theatrical productions, and philosophical treatises that used his story to explore fundamental questions about human nature and social development. His case became a touchstone for debates about the relationship between civilization and barbarism, the nature of identity and memory, and the possibility of human perfectibility. Most significantly, Caspar's story embodied the Romantic era's fascination with mystery and its belief in the possibility of extraordinary individuals who might challenge conventional understanding of human potential. Whether he was a genuine wild child, a clever imposter, or something between these extremes, His brief life illuminated the complex relationship between evidence and belief, between scientific investigation and romantic imagination that would continue to characterize European culture as it struggled to reconcile Enlightenment rationalism with romantic sensibility. Oscar II of Sweden, replaced. The year 1898 dawned over Stockholm with the crisp clarity that makes Scandinavian winters feel like crystal, and in the modest apartment where August Möllers bent over his clerk's ledgers, calculating figures that would never make him wealthy, a different kind of calculation was taking shape. The Swedish capital hummed with the confidence of a nation that had found prosperity through peace. Its newspapers filled with reports of technological marvels and social progress that seemed to validate the constitutional monarchy's steady hand. But Möllers, his pen scratching across columns of mundane commercial data, was contemplating a fiction so audacious that it would briefly transform him from anonymous bureaucrat into the center of a scandal that shook the very foundations of royal legitimacy. August Möllers was not a man whom history should have remembered. His life followed the predictable trajectory of middle-class respectability in Oscar II's Sweden education, sufficient for clerical work, employment steady if unremarkable, social position comfortable if undistinguished. He possessed the kind of methodical intelligence that made him valuable to employers and invisible to everyone else, spending his days in the grey twilight of administrative routine that characterized modern bureaucratic life. But beneath this facade of contentment, Möllers nursed ambitions and resentments that would soon explode into public view. The story that Möllers began to circulate through Stockholm's coffee houses and newspaper offices was breathtaking in its implications and meticulous in its construction. According to his carefully crafted narrative, the man who sat on Sweden's throne as Oscar II was not the legitimate heir to the Bernadotte dynasty, but an impostor who had been substituted for the real prince sometime during his infancy. The true Oscar had been spirited away and raised in obscurity, while a changeling had grown up in the royal palace, eventually ascending to a throne that was rightfully not his. The timing of Möllers's revelation was no accident. Sweden in the 1890s was experiencing the kind of social transformation that made traditional authority appear vulnerable to challenge. Industrialization was creating new social classes whose loyalty to ancient institutions could not be taken for granted, while democratic movements across Europe were questioning the very foundations of monarchical rule. In this atmosphere of change and uncertainty, even the most stable royal house might find itself subject to scrutiny that would have been unthinkable in earlier eras. The evidence that Möllers presented to support his extraordinary claims was surprisingly sophisticated, revealing either genuine research skills or remarkable talent for fabrication. He claimed to possess documents that proved the royal substitution, witnesses who could confirm the deception, and genealogical proof that he himself was descended from the displaced legitimate line. More importantly, he demonstrated detailed knowledge of royal family history and court procedures that seemed to lend credibility to his assertions. The pamphlets that Möllers began to distribute throughout Stockholm were masterpieces of conspiracy theory, combining factual information about the royal family with speculative connections that suggested a web of deception stretching back decades. His writing style was measured and scholarly rather than inflammatory, creating an impression of careful investigation rather than wild accusation. This restraint made his claims more credible to audiences who might have dismissed more obviously sensational attacks on royal legitimacy. The response from Stockholm's intellectual community was surprisingly divided, reflecting the complex relationship between traditional deference and modern skepticism that characterized late 19th century Swedish society. Some dismissed Möllers as a crank whose fantasies deserved no serious attention, but others found his arguments intriguing enough to merit investigation. The fact that educated people were willing to consider his claims, even briefly, revealed how the foundations of royal authority had become more fragile than they appeared. The press coverage that followed Möllers's initial revelations demonstrated how modern journalism was beginning to transform the relationship between monarchy and public opinion. Newspapers that had traditionally shown reflexive deference to royal authority now found themselves competing to provide the most thorough coverage of the controversy, turning questions of royal legitimacy into matters of public entertainment and democratic debate. The official response from the royal court was swift and comprehensive, revealing how seriously the monarchy took even apparently frivolous challenges to its legitimacy. Palace officials provided detailed documentation of Oscar II's birth and early life, medical records that confirmed his identity, and testimony from courtiers who had known the king since childhood. This evidence was overwhelming in its scope and convincing in its detail, making Mellers's claims appear increasingly implausible. The legal action that followed marked one of the first occasions when a European monarchy had been forced to defend its legitimacy in court, rather than simply dismissing challenges through executive authority. The trial that ensued was both farcical and precedent-setting, establishing procedures for how democracies might handle attacks on traditional institutions, while maintaining respect for both royal dignity and popular sovereignty. The cross-examination of Mellers revealed the fundamental weaknesses in his case, while also exposing the psychological motivations that had driven him to make such extraordinary claims. Under oath, his evidence crumbled, his witnesses proved unreliable, and his documents were revealed as clever forgeries. But the trial also revealed a man who seemed genuinely convinced of his own story, suggesting that his imposture had evolved from calculated deception into sincere delusion. The verdict was never in doubt, but the trial's real significance lay in its demonstration of how modern legal systems could address challenges to traditional authority, without resorting to the summary executions that had characterized earlier responses to royal pretenders. Mellers was sentenced to imprisonment for fraud and defamation, a punishment that acknowledged the seriousness of his offense while treating him as a misguided citizen rather than a treasonous subject. The media aftermath of the trial provided early evidence of how mass communication was beginning to transform the nature of celebrity and scandal in democratic societies. Muller's story was picked up by newspapers across Europe, turning his local Swedish controversy into an international sensation that revealed the widespread public fascination with royal scandals and conspiracy theories. The Republican movements that existed on the margins of Swedish political life attempted to use the Möllers affair to advance their own agenda, arguing that the very possibility of such controversies demonstrated the absurdity of hereditary monarchy in an age of democratic governance. However, their efforts largely backfired, as the monarchy's dignified response to the crisis actually enhanced its reputation for stability and wisdom. The psychological analysis of Möllers's case, conducted according to the emerging psychiatric theories of the late 19th century, provided new insights into the mental processes that could drive individuals to create elaborate conspiracy theories about royal identity. Medical experts suggested that his delusions might have been symptomatic of specific mental disorders, introducing scientific explanations for behavior that had previously been understood purely in moral or political terms. The diplomatic implications of the affair were surprisingly significant, as foreign governments had to decide how to respond to allegations that questioned the legitimacy of a fellow monarch. The general consensus was to treat the matter as an internal Swedish concern, while privately expressing relief that the controversy had been resolved without damage to the broader principle of royal authority. The technological aspects of the case revealed how modern methods of documentation and verification were beginning to make traditional forms of royal imposture more difficult to sustain. Photography, detailed birth records, and improved communication systems all contributed to making identity fraud more challenging, while also creating new opportunities for those skilled enough to exploit the system's limitations. The cultural legacy of the Möllers affair proved remarkably durable, inspiring fictional treatments that explored themes of identity, legitimacy, and the relationship between individual ambition and institutional authority. His story became a template for examining how modern democratic societies might handle challenges to traditional institutions while maintaining both order and freedom. The feminist interpretations of the case that emerged in the 20th century focused on how the controversy revealed the exclusively masculine nature of royal succession and the ways in which questions of legitimacy were inherently tied to patriarchal assumptions about bloodline and inheritance. These analyses used Melles's story to critique broader patterns of gender inequality in European political systems. Most significantly, the Mellers affair marked an important transition in how European societies understood and responded to challenges to traditional authority. The combination of legal process, media coverage, and public debate that characterized the Swedish response established precedents that would influence how future democracies dealt with similar controversies, while revealing how monarchical institutions might adapt to survive in an age of mass communication and popular sovereignty. The case also demonstrated how the modern world's relationship with monarchy had become simultaneously more sentimental and more skeptical than anything previous generations had experienced. The public's fascination with royal scandals coexisted with genuine respect for constitutional monarchy, creating a complex dynamic that would continue to characterize European attitudes toward royal authority well into the 20th century and beyond. Anna Anderson. The February snow fell thick and silent over the Landwehr Canal in Berlin, muffling the sounds of a city still reeling from war and revolution, when the murky waters gave up a secret that would captivate the world for decades to come. In the early hours of February 17, 1920, police officers pulled a young woman from the canal's icy embrace, her attempt at suicide thwarted by chance and circumstance. She carried no identification, spoke no recognizable language, and seemed lost in a world of private suffering that prevented coherent communication. The authorities who processed her as an unknown patient could never have imagined that this broken figure would soon claim to be the most famous missing person in the world, Anastasia, youngest daughter of Tsar Nicholas II and sole survivor of the Romanov family's massacre. The woman who would become known as Anna Anderson spent her first weeks of recovery in the charity ward of a Berlin hospital, her silence broken only by occasional outbursts in what sounded like Russian. The doctors who treated her noted signs of severe trauma, both physical and psychological, that suggested a past filled with unimaginable horror. Her hands bore scars that might have come from bullets or blades. Her body showed evidence of prolonged malnutrition, and her mind seemed to retreat from any attempt to probe the memories that haunted her waking hours. The first suggestion that this mysterious patient might be connected to the Russian imperial family came not from her own claims, but from the speculation of other patients who shared her ward. Russian émigrés fleeing the chaos of revolution and civil war had flooded into Berlin, bringing with them stories of narrow escapes and miraculous survivals that made even the most extraordinary tales seem plausible. When whispers began that the silent woman bore a resemblance to the missing Grand Duchess Anastasia, they found fertile ground in a community desperate for hope and vindication. The transformation from nameless patient to possible princess began gradually, as Anna Anderson's name she eventually adopted started to remember fragments of a past that seemed to align with the tragedy of the Russian imperial family. Her memories, when they came, were heartbreakingly specific. The basement room in Ipatiev house, the sound of gunfire, the weight of jewels sewn into clothing that had saved her life when bullets struck. She spoke of loyal soldiers who had spirited her away from the massacre, of months of recovery in Romanian exile, of the terrifying journey that had brought her to Berlin, and the canal where she had sought to end her suffering. The émigré community that embraced Anna Anderson's claims was perfectly positioned to provide both support and authentication for her extraordinary story. Former courtiers who had known the imperial family, servants who had worked in the Alexander Palace, and relatives who had shared the Romanovs' gilded captivity all examined the woman who claimed to be their beloved Anastasia. Their responses were divided but passionate, with some expressing absolute conviction that they recognized the lost Grand Duchess, while others dismissed her as an obvious impostor or tragic victim of delusion. The legal battles that consumed much of Anna Anderson's later life were unprecedented in their scope and complexity, involving courts in multiple countries and raising fundamental questions about how identity could be established in an age where documentation had been destroyed by war and revolution. Her attempts to claim inheritance rights from the Romanov fortune, deposited in banks across Europe before the revolution, forced legal systems to grapple with evidence that was necessarily circumstantial and often contradictory. The scientific methods that were gradually applied to Anna Anderson's case represented cutting-edge attempts to resolve questions of identity through objective analysis rather than subjective recognition. Handwriting experts compared her script to authenticated samples of Anastasia's childhood letters. Anthropologists measured her facial features against known photographs of the Grand Duchess, and medical specialists examined scars and physical characteristics that might confirm or disprove her claims. The results of these investigations were tantalizingly inconclusive, providing enough support for her claims to maintain hope among believers, while offering sufficient contradictory evidence to satisfy skeptics. Her handwriting showed similarities to Anastasia's that could indicate either authentic identity or skilled imitation. Her physical measurements matched some descriptions while contradicting others. Most frustratingly, her own testimony was both convincingly detailed and mysteriously vague, as if trauma had preserved some memories while destroying others. The international dimensions of Anna Anderson's case reflected the global fascination with the Romanov tragedy and the romantic appeal of royal survival stories. Newspapers across Europe and America followed her legal battles with the kind of attention typically reserved for movie stars and political scandals, while readers devoured every detail of her claims and counterclaims. Her story became a form of international entertainment that satisfied the public appetite for both tragedy and hope. The psychological interpretations of Anna Anderson's case evolved significantly over the decades, reflecting changing understanding of trauma, memory, and identity formation. Early analysts focused on determining whether she was a conscious fraud or genuine victim of amnesia, but later experts recognized that the boundaries between authentic and constructed memory were far more complex than previous generations had understood. The cultural impact of her story was enormous, inspiring novels, films, and theatrical productions that transformed the tragedy of the Romanov family into romantic entertainment. The musical Anastasia and countless fictional treatments created a popular mythology around the lost princess that often bore little resemblance to historical reality, but satisfied deep human needs for stories of survival and ultimate vindication. The DNA revolution of the 1990s finally provided tools that earlier investigators could only have dreamed of, making possible definitive resolution of questions that had puzzled the world for 3/4 of a century. The genetic analysis that compared Anna Anderson's DNA with authenticated samples from the Romanov family line conclusively established that she was not Anastasia Romanova, ending decades of speculation with scientific certainty that could not be disputed. The revelation of Anna Anderson's true identity as Franziska Szankowska, a Polish factory worker who had suffered a mental breakdown, transformed her from romantic figure into tragic example of how desperate circumstances could drive individuals to construct elaborate alternative realities. Her story became a case study in the psychology of identity formation and the social processes that could sustain even demonstrably false claims when they satisfied powerful emotional needs. The discovery of the actual Romanov remains in the 1990s, confirmed through DNA analysis and forensic investigation, finally resolved the historical questions that had made Anna Anderson's claims plausible. The evidence proved that all members of the imperial family had indeed died in Ipatiev House, ending forever the possibility that any Romanov children had survived the massacre that had claimed their parents. The feminist interpretations of Anna Anderson's case that emerged in the late 20th century focused on how her story reflected broader patterns of female agency and victimization in a male-dominated world. Her decades-long struggle to establish her identity and claim her inheritance revealed the particular challenges that women faced in asserting their rights in legal and social systems designed primarily to serve masculine interests. The medical re-examination of Anna Anderson's case in light of modern understanding of post-traumatic stress disorder and dissociative identity conditions provided new insights into how extreme trauma could reshape memory and personality. Her symptoms were consistent with conditions that were not recognized or properly treated during her lifetime, suggesting that her claims might have been genuine subjective experiences, even if they were not objectively accurate. Most significantly, Anna Anderson's story illuminated the complex relationship between historical truth and psychological need that characterized much of the 20th century's relationship with the past. Her ability to convince sophisticated observers for decades that she was someone she was not revealed, how powerfully people wanted to believe in survival and justice, even when evidence suggested that hope was misplaced. The broader implications of her case extended far beyond questions of individual identity to encompass fundamental issues about how societies process trauma and loss. The Romanov massacre had represented not just the death of a family but the violent end of an entire world, and Anna Anderson's claims offered the possibility that something might have been preserved from that destruction. Even after her claims were disproven, her story continued to serve as a reminder of how the human spirit could persist in asserting hope against even the most overwhelming evidence of tragedy and finality. Flora MacDonald, restored. The mists of the Scottish Highlands seemed to carry echoes of ancient songs when Flora MacDonald stepped from the small boat onto the shores of Skye in June 1746. Her heart pounding with the knowledge that she carried more than just a disguised passenger. She bore the hopes and dreams of a cause that would soon be lost forever. Beside her walked a figure who would become legend, Prince Charles Edward Stuart, the young pretender, transformed by desperation and feminine clothing into Betty Burke, an Irish spinning maid whose supposed innocence concealed the last hope of the Jacobite dream. But as the years passed and the prince's star faded into exile and alcoholism, the story of that dramatic escape would inspire a different kind of imposture, one that transformed Flora herself from heroic helper into something approaching royal status in the romantic imagination of those who refused to let dead dreams lie peacefully in their graves. The historical Flora MacDonald had lived a life remarkable enough without embellishment. Her courage in aiding the fugitive prince, earning her imprisonment in the Tower of London, and eventual celebrity as the embodiment of Highland loyalty and feminine virtue. After her release, she had emigrated to North Carolina with her husband, lived through the American Revolution, and returned to Scotland to die in comfortable obscurity, her fame resting securely on that single act of romantic daring that had saved the Stuart cause's last hope from capture and probable execution. But the Flora MacDonald, who began to appear in the romantic literature and political mythology of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, was a figure transformed by nostalgia and nationalist longing into something far grander than historical reality could support. In the stories told by Highland societies, Jacobite sympathizers, and romantic poets, she became not merely the courageous woman who had aided a prince but a quasi-royal figure herself, elevated by her association with royal blood and her embodiment of Highland virtue into a status that bordered on the mythical. The process by which Flora MacDonald's historical identity was gradually replaced by her mythological persona revealed how imposture could work in reverse, with legend overwhelming fact rather than a living person claiming false identity. The real woman's story was dramatic enough, but the cultural needs of a Scotland grappling with the aftermath of Culloden and the destruction of clan society demanded something more, a figure who could embody both the tragedy of the lost cause and the enduring nobility of Highland culture. The literary treatments that proliferated around Flora MacDonald's story consistently elevated her status beyond what the historical record could support, presenting her as a kind of Highland princess whose natural nobility rivaled that of the prince she had saved. These fictional Flora MacDonalds possessed supernatural beauty, mystical wisdom, and an almost divine connection to the landscape and traditions of the Highlands that made them seem like figures from Celtic mythology rather than 18th century reality. The political implications of Flora MacDonald's mythologization were significant, as her story became a rallying point for various forms of Scottish nationalism and cultural resistance to English domination. The woman who had once saved a Stuart prince was transformed into a symbol of Scottish independence itself, her legendary status serving the same function that active pretenders had served in earlier eras, offering hope that the current order was temporary and that ancient virtues might yet be restored. The emergence of individuals claiming to be descendants or spiritual heirs of Flora MacDonald represented a new form of imposture, where people appropriated not royal blood, but association with royal romance. These pretenders to Flora's legacy claimed to possess her letters, her personal effects, or her secret knowledge about the prince's escape, trading on her mythological status to gain attention and sometimes financial benefit from those who cherished the Jacobite dream. The most audacious of these Flora MacDonald claimants was a woman who appeared in Edinburgh in the early 1800s, insisting that she was Flora's secret daughter, born of a liaison with Prince Charles Edward Stuart himself during their dramatic flight across the Highlands. This alleged daughter claimed to possess royal blood through her supposed father, while inheriting the heroic virtue of her supposed mother, creating a genealogical fantasy that combined romantic appeal with dynastic pretension. The evidence that this pretender presented was characteristic of early 19th century imposturia, mixture of forged documents, manufactured relics, and carefully researched knowledge about Highland history that seemed to support her extraordinary claims. She possessed what appeared to be love letters between Flora and the prince, jewelry that allegedly bore royal monograms, and detailed knowledge of secret hiding places used during the famous escape that convinced some observers of her authenticity. The Highland community's response to these claims revealed the complex relationship between historical memory and cultural identity that characterized post-Culloden Scotland. Some embraced the pretender as validation of their ancestors' significance and confirmation that the old stories retained living relevance. Others rejected her as a fraud who diminished the genuine heroism of the historical Flora MacDonald by suggesting that her motives had been romantic rather than purely patriotic. The investigation that eventually exposed the false daughter's deception was conducted by antiquarians and historians who had begun to apply more rigorous standards to questions of historical authenticity. Their methods combined traditional documentary research with emerging techniques of textual analysis, revealing inconsistencies in the pretender's story and anachronisms in her supposedly 18th century evidence. The psychological portrait that emerged from the exposure showed a woman who seemed genuinely convinced of her own identity, suggesting that she had internalized her fiction so completely that the boundary between performance and belief had disappeared. Her case illustrated how the Romantic movement's celebration of emotion and intuition over reason and evidence could create conditions where elaborate self-deception became psychologically sustainable. The broader phenomenon of Flora MacDonald imposture extended beyond individual pretenders to encompass a whole industry of manufactured Highland nostalgia that transformed genuine historical figures into commercial commodities. Tartan manufacturers, tourist promoters, and purveyors of Highland romance all contributed to creating a version of Flora MacDonald that bore increasingly little resemblance to the historical woman, but satisfied the emotional needs of audiences hungry for connection to a more heroic past. The international dimensions of Flora MacDonald mythology revealed how Scottish emigrant communities around the world used her story to maintain cultural identity in alien environments. From Nova Scotia to Australia, Highland societies elevated her to semi-royal status, making her birthday a celebration of Scottish heritage and her story a cornerstone of expatriate identity formation. The feminist reinterpretations of Flora MacDonald's legacy that emerged in the 20th century focused on how her mythologization both celebrated and constrained female agency, presenting her as a model of feminine virtue, while simultaneously limiting women's roles to supporting male heroes rather than achieving heroism in their own right. These analyses revealed how imposture and mythology could serve both liberating and restrictive functions depending on the cultural context in which they operated. The literary legacy of the Flora MacDonald phenomenon proved remarkably durable, inspiring countless novels, poems, and theatrical productions that continued to elaborate on themes of Highland romance and Jacobite nostalgia well into the modern era. Each retelling seemed to add new elements to her story, gradually transforming the historical woman into a figure of pure legend whose mythological significance far exceeded her actual historical importance. The tourism industry that developed around Flora MacDonald's memory created its own forms of imposture, with multiple sites claiming to be her birthplace, burial site, or the location of crucial events in her life. These competing claims reflected the commercial value of association with her legend, while demonstrating how historical truth could become irrelevant when mythology proved more profitable than accuracy. Most significantly, the Flora MacDonald phenomenon illustrated how imposture could function as a form of cultural resistance, allowing communities to assert alternative versions of history that better served their emotional and political needs than official narratives. Her transformation from historical figure to mythological persona revealed how societies created the heroes they needed rather than simply accepting the ones that history had provided. The enduring appeal of Flora MacDonald's story, whether historically accurate or romantically embellished, demonstrated the persistent human need for figures who embodied ideals of loyalty, courage, and romantic sacrifice. Her evolution from woman to legend to object of imposture revealed how the boundary between reality and myth could become meaningless when stories served purposes that transcended simple factual accuracy. In becoming more than herself, Flora MacDonald had created space for others to claim connection to her elevated status, proving that sometimes the most successful impostures were those that didn't require living pretenders, but could be sustained by collective imagination and cultural desire.